Chapter 124. Compared to the citizens of the capital who were waiting to see what was going on, Fan Xian was in low spirits. He was carefully writing a few notes in his study, doing his best to rewrite the Overwatch Council's intelligence analysis report. Using the tone of a young master who had lived in the capital for a long time, he rewrote it into a slightly scholarly judgment. This was to prevent the jaws of the officials of the office of the Grand Herald from dropping to the ground when they heard his report. They would suspect that, besides the Emperor's Overwatch Council, the Kingdom of Qing had another terrifying intelligence agency, and that this agency was working for a mere 8th-level functionary. Fan Ruoruo wasn't in a good mood either. She copied it in small script and stuck the slip of paper together. "Brother, this is really strange. Where did you get this information? Why didn't you just use it? Why did you have to make it sound so ridiculous?" Fan Xian rarely hid anything from his sister. In this regard, even Lin Wan'er could not compare to Ruoruo. He said bitterly, "At first I was just being lazy, so I wanted to borrow their power. Who would have thought that I would create such a meticulous and terrifying case? The source of this information cannot see the light of day, so I couldn't just hand it over to the office of the Grand Herald." Who is the envoy from Northern Qi this time? Fan Ruoruo was actually very happy that her brother could finally openly participate in court politics. Although Fan Xian had taught her since she was very young, she was still a girl who had grown up in the world of the Kingdom of Qing. She had always thought that a man who made tofu every day could only be treated as entertainment, and could not be sustained for long. Not the Emperor's party, not the Empress Dowager's party, and certainly not the Crown Prince's party. As Fan Xian sorted out the information on the table, he casually replied, "It is the Northern Qi Empress's brother, Chang Ningho. I hear he is also a great scholar. But this time the most eye-catching person in the Northern Qi envoy is not him, but his teacher. Northern Qi's literary master of a generation is called Zhuang Mohan. As long as one is a scholar, he is greatly admired. I don't know what price Northern Qi paid to pull him into the envoy. When the time comes, even His Majesty will have to give him some face. I'm afraid this butcher's style of demanding land and money will have to be toned down a bit." Zhuang Mohan? Fan Ruoruo was shocked and her face glowed. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his sister look like a star chaser. Ruoruo had always been a very cold woman. Aside from her brother, who she adored, she had never paid any attention to other scholars. For some reason, Fan Xian felt a little jealous. Fortunately, the case file clearly states that this Zhuang Mohan is already 70 years old. Otherwise, I would have to be a little more careful. Fan Ruoruo said shyly, "As a brother, how can you not be serious?" Fan Xian laughed and said, "If you really like that old man, then you are the one who is not proper." Seeing that Ruoruo was about to get angry, he quickly waved his hand and said, "Let's be serious. Do you have any ideas about what I told you that day at the country estate?" That night, the moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The brother and sister were sitting in the field worrying about the little girl's future marriage. Ruoruo fretted for a while, but in the end, not a single one of the 4 young talents caught her eye, so she gave up. At that moment, Fan Xian thought of something and frowned. "Last time, when we coincidentally met His Majesty at the Lujing River, didn't he say something?" "What did he say?" Fan Ruoruo showed a rare confused expression. It seemed that the brother and sister were too shocked at the time, and their memories were a little fuzzy. Fan Xian closed his eyes for a long time. Suddenly, he opened them and slapped the table. "His Majesty wants to arrange a marriage for you." "Ah." Fan Ruoruo was quite frightened. What were the children of officials most afraid of? Marriage. If they were lucky like Lin Wan'er, they would be married to Fan Xian. If they were like Taichang Temple's Ren Shaoqin, who was married to a tigress princess, they would not be happy for the rest of their lives. And of all the marriage arrangements, the most frightening was the one that came from the palace. The emperor's will could not be disobeyed. Even if you were to marry a hedonistic son of a rich family, you would not be able to reason with him. In the past, officials and eunuchs still had the possibility of sending their daughters to the palace to win the emperor's favor. But this emperor was not interested in women, so this path was blocked. Even the crown prince and the 2 adult princes did not dare to take more than 1 concubine. Although the crown prince's lecherous reputation was known throughout the capital, there were only 3 cold and lonely concubines in the eastern palace. Fan Ruoruo also remembered the emperor's seemingly unintentional words. She was quite shocked and tears welled up in her eyes. "What should we do?" she asked in a trembling voice. Fan Xian's mind worked quickly, and he immediately came up with a few possible families. He narrowed his eyes and said, "The Great Prince, the Second Prince, and the Crown Prince of King Jing." Although my father is only an assistant minister, based on the Fan family's position, the emperor will probably only choose one of these three. If he chooses one of the minister's sons, then there is nothing to be afraid of. If you are not willing, I naturally have a way to reject this marriage. If the marriage was to be arranged to the son of a minister, and his sister was not willing, Fan Xian would naturally think of many ways. After all, behind him stood his father, Qin Pingping, and the prime minister. They were the so-called three powerful people, and even the crown prince of the Eastern Palace was trying to rope him in. As long as it was not one of the two princes or Crown Prince Jing, Fan Xian was confident that he could ruin all the marriages his sister did not want. However, the three young nobles were most likely to be the ones who were the most powerful. Fan Xian was quiet for a moment, and then suddenly couldn't help but curse. I was wondering why Li Hongqing went to the brothel every day but refused to get married. So he was waiting here. Seeing his sister's frightened expression, Fan Xian smiled and comforted her. The eldest prince has been fighting in the Western barbarians for many years, and I hear he is also outstanding in martial arts. Although I have never met the second prince, I hear he is also a very powerful person. As for Crown Prince Jing, Li Hongqing, the two of us are familiar with each other. Aside from his somewhat playful nature, there is nothing bad about him. If you really do marry Li Hongqing with me on your side, I won't even let him take a concubine into his room, let alone a brothel. Don't worry, sister. It would have been better if he hadn't comforted her. Now that he had analyzed the situation, Ruoruo felt more and more certain that it was true, as if it was about to happen. She said sorrowfully, "Brother, but I don't want to marry any of these three." Fan Xian sighed. He didn't want to continue discussing the troubles of growing up. In a gentle voice he teased, "What's so bad about that? When I see you in the future, I'll have to call you a concubine or something. If the second prince really does become emperor, and you're the mother of the world, wouldn't that make you my mother?" This joke was not very funny, so Ruoruo didn't laugh through her tears. There was an awkward silence in the study. In the silence, the brother and sister both had their own worries. Ruoruo was confused, while Fan Xian was determined. If something really did happen in the future, he had to prepare for it. The location for the negotiations was not very spacious. It was set up in the largest room in Honglu Temple. There was no extremely long table between the Northern Qi envoy and the Qing official. Instead, it was as if they were having a casual chat. They sat in their respective chairs with tea on the table, and chatted as if they were having a casual conversation. Fan Xian insisted on sitting in the most inconspicuous chair at the bottom. He looked at the scene with cold eyes and thought of a phrase from his previous life, tea party. Although he was nominally the deputy envoy because the process had not yet entered the final stage, and he insisted on sitting below, the official from Honglu Temple couldn't do anything. Under the gentle exchange of words, there was a hidden glint of swords. Before long, the voices of the officials of the two countries, who had already seen the outcome of the battle, gradually grew louder. Some of the more impatient officials' buttocks were about to leave the surface of their chairs. "I don't know whether Northern Qi won this battle on the northern border, or our court won." A sixth-level official registrar of the Honglu Temple could no longer tolerate the other party's unreasonable words. He stood up and sternly rebuked them. "Battles are dangerous. His Majesty of Northern Qi is worried about his subjects and people, and so he benevolently and righteously stopped the battle. Victory and defeat have not been decided, so how can we know who the winner is? If the envoy of Northern Qi was not thick-skinned, he would not have been sent to be the vanguard." Seeing the mustached man speak as if it were a matter of course, even the usually calm Fan Xian wanted to rush forward and beat him up. Xan Chiwu of the Honglu Temple smiled slightly, but Fan Xian could see a trace of treachery in his smile. This treachery was the confidence that the Qin kingdom had accumulated through 20 years of victories. He heard the high-ranking official of the Qin kingdom say quietly, "In that case, please return. Between our two countries we will fight again. After a true victory has been decided, it will not be too late to negotiate." What was this? This was an undisguised threat. This was undisguised state terrorism. This was undisguised hooliganism. Fan Xian did not show any shock on his face, but in his heart he was incomparably impressed. This Xan Chiwu is quite daring. As expected, as soon as he said this, the Northern Qi side began to attack the Qing officials for speaking carelessly, causing irreparable damage to the friendship between the two countries. Unexpectedly, Xan Chiwu continued to coldly reply, "Between our two countries, when has there ever been such a thing as friendship? This is probably how Wei Xiaobao negotiates." Fan Xian clicked his tongue in his heart. A high-ranking official of the Honglu Temple was acting like a scoundrel in the relationship between the two countries. If it were not for the fact that the kingdom of Qing was truly powerful, this situation would never have occurred. The negotiations of the Honglu Temple had always been well coordinated. The red-faced and black-faced officials took turns to take the stage, and as expected, another official stood up with a face full of benevolence. Everyone, do not forget your duties. Do not let your emotions affect His Majesty's original intention of restoring the friendship between our two countries. The two sides brushed their sleeves and left, and the tea party ended. The high-ranking officials had already revealed their identities, and the actual fighting at the negotiating table was left to the lower-ranking officials, who worked hard to do it. But the negotiations had reached an impasse, and for the time being they could not move forward. As for the Northern Qi envoy Zhuang Mohan, after entering the palace to speak with the Empress Dowager, he rarely came out to see people. Fan Xian was a little puzzled. Was that old man here on vacation? Chapter 125. 2 days later, in the office of the Grand Herald. Exchanging captives is the first major event. Xian Qiwu was no longer as reckless as when the two countries were negotiating. He said lightly, "His Majesty has decreed that the captured soldiers must be returned no matter what. Everything else is trivial. We might as well make some concessions in this regard." An official replied, "The number of people captured from Northern Qi and the small countries they control has been roughly tallied. There are more than 2,400 people. On our side, about 1,000 people were captured. According to His Majesty's decree, even if we were to exchange our captives, we would still be able to get them back." Yes. Xian Qiwu nodded, satisfied with his subordinate's efficiency. Regarding the issue of redrawing the border, His Majesty's intentions are clear. We will not give up an inch of the land we have taken. If Northern Qi wants it, they will have to exchange it with the grasslands of Qianlong Bay. Qianlong Bay was in the northwest of the Kingdom of Qing, and it was connected to the only enclave of the Kingdom of Qing there. If they could take it back, that enclave would be safe. The officials noted down their superiors' intentions. One of them said, "But for some reason, Northern Qi has been particularly unyielding this time. It seems they want to fight to the death. They have only agreed to give us money and horses, but they are not willing to cede the land." The first person to jump out at the tea party was an impulsive person. He slammed the table and scolded, "We have already taken the land. Are we going to have to give it back?" Xian Qiwu nodded. Although Master Zhao's words are a bit direct, they do make sense. He coldly glanced at his subordinates, put down the teacup in his hand and said, "My fellow colleagues, don't forget that these lands were won by our soldiers with swords and spears. They were exchanged with blood and flesh. Of course we can't give them back with both hands. Those soldiers have paid with their lives. What about us? We are only moving our lips, so we cannot give up on the interests of our own countries. We must fight with them for a tael of silver and an inch of land." The man who had spoken earlier continued to frown. "What you say is very true, sir. But according to the secret reports from the envoy stationed in Shangjing, the relationship between the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi has become warmer because of this defeat. Furthermore, the Empress Dowager's brother has already been punished and returned home. If we ask for too much in the negotiations and the two countries go to war again after a breakdown, this would not be in line with His Majesty's wishes. Everyone should know that if Northern Qi is truly of one mind, even a centipede with 100 legs would not feel good if it bit someone. Shangjing of Northern Qi is too far away. Going there and back, this information might not be useful." Xian Qiwu felt a headache coming on. The most important thing in negotiations was to know yourself and your enemy. Although they had the home advantage and the advantage of being the victor, the other side was in their own capital. They could rely on the Northern Qi spy network that the court had not yet had time to clean up. They could have first-hand information on the Qing court's reaction, but it would be difficult for the Qing side to know the true reaction of the Northern Qi court. Someone suggested, "Why don't we ask His Majesty to have the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council assist us? You should know that the people of the 4th Bureau in Northern Qi are much more powerful than those of the other yamens of the court." Everyone's eyes brightened. This was true. As officials of the capital, of course they feared and hated the Overwatch Council. But if the mad dog, the Overwatch Council, was used to deal with the enemy, no one would object. They would all be in favor of it. Unexpectedly, hearing this suggestion, Xian Qiwu suddenly lost his poise. He scolded, "What you have thought of, haven't I and the prefect not thought of it? If Yen Luo Dian doesn't want to give us anything, what can I do? Do I have to go cry in front of His Majesty's palace?" So that was how it was. Their faces became calm again, but deep down they thought, if you can get information on Northern Qi, what is there to be afraid of crying on the stone steps in front of Xingqing Palace? The hall fell silent. Although the officials and people of the Qing kingdom had always thought of themselves as the strongest country in the world, before His Majesty ascended the throne, the people of the Qing kingdom had always lived under the terrifying shadow of Northern Wei. Although Northern Wei had been reduced to half of its territory by His Majesty on 3 northern expeditions, becoming the Northern Qi of today, if they were forced into a corner again, it would still be a terrifying thing. So without the support of strong confidence, the negotiations seemed to be stuck in a stalemate. Tonight, I will go to the palace again to ask for His Majesty's decree. Xan Chiwu frowned, but his eyes glanced at Fan Xian, who had been sitting quietly at the end. Fan Xian seemed to have no self-awareness as a deputy. These days, whether it was negotiations or anything else, he always sat there with a smile on his face. No one knew what he was thinking. Xan Chiwu had been sent here by the Crown Prince's edict to give Fan Xian some political capital. Fan Xian was sensible enough not to take credit, but it was not good for him to be so silent. He thought for a moment, then said gently, "Master Fan, what do you think of this?" Fan Xian clenched his fists in his sleeves, but his face remained calm. He said gently, "I think that Northern Qi is just bluffing. If they really have the strength to fight again, they would not be in such a hurry to send a diplomatic mission to sue for peace." The officials all knew that Master Fan was famous for his poetry and fists, and they had admired his quiet and unambitious attitude these days, so they had some expectations of what he would say. But when they found out that he could only say such a general statement, they could not help but feel disappointed. But for the sake of face, the officials could not say anything, so they casually agreed. Xan Chiwu, on the other hand, thought that since he was going to do Fan Xian a favor, he might as well do it thoroughly. He continued to ask gently, "What you say is reasonable. But in the relationship between two countries, what is real is fake and what is fake is real. A country is like a person, and sometimes it is dominated by emotions, so it cannot be judged by reason. Do you have any other evidence, Deputy Fan?" He really did hope that Fan Xian could strengthen the conviction of the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. Fan Xian inwardly praised the Vice Minister for saying that a country is like a person. He thought for a moment, then said, "The key is that Zhuang Mohan. You all know his position in the hearts of the world's scholars. If Northern Qi did not intend to sue for peace, they would not have spent so much to invite Zhuang Mohan to the capital with the diplomatic mission." The officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies all came from the imperial examinations, so of course they knew of Zhuang Mohan's name. After a moment's thought, they realized that this was indeed the case. But this alone was not enough to bring the negotiations back to the original path. Xan Chiwu frowned. If we could find out why Zhuang Mohan was willing to come, perhaps it would be of some help. The Overwatch Council's files clearly stated that Zhuang Mohan was willing to come because, first, the Empress Dowager and the Emperor of Northern Qi had lowered themselves to beg him. Second, Zhuang Mohan had always prided himself as a mortal saint, and wanted to mediate the military conflict between the two countries. The third reason seemed to be his personal reasons, which had not yet been discovered. Although Fan Xian despised the attitude of this saint, he would not belittle his reputation. But at this moment he would not reveal these reasons in front of all the officials. He only replied quietly, "If we could meet him, perhaps we would be able to find some clues." Registrar Xiao shook his head and said somewhat helplessly, "According to the customs of the two countries, such a person is usually only seen at banquets in front of the palace. If an official of the Chamberlain of Dependencies asks for an audience, and he refuses, there is nothing we can do. We would only be humiliating ourselves." Suddenly his eyes brightened. "But Deputy Fan's reputation for poetry has long been known throughout the world. I believe that Zhuang Mohan would not refuse the title of meeting friends through poetry." Fan Xian was surprised. He had only copied 3 poems and 2 of them had been written by Ruoruo. How could he make his reputation known throughout the world? Fortunately, Xan Chiwu shook his head and helped him out. Zhuang Mohan has always been an extremely arrogant person. His scholarly works, poetry and songs are all the top talents of the world. There is no way he would lower himself to meet Deputy Fan. In my opinion, the key to Northern Qi's invitation this time is the banquet in front of the palace. They want to use his reputation to persuade His Majesty. The officials thought that this was probably the case. After the meeting was over, Fan Xian found an opportunity to pull Xan Chiwu aside and hand over the proposal that he and Ruoruo had spent several nights organizing. Xan Chiwu flipped through it hastily and his eyes brightened. He had not expected Fan Xian to write something like this. Although the evidence was rather absurd, after careful analysis, it seemed to point directly at the current situation in northern Qi. Good. Xan Qiwu said excitedly. With this, the office of the Grand Herald will have more confidence in our negotiations. But, Deputy Fan, why did you not mention it before and now you are giving it to me in private? Fan Xian looked at his superior's suspicious expression and smiled. Some of the deductions are a bit absurd. These are my personal opinions, so I did not dare say them in public. I am only giving them to you in private for your consideration. Xan Qiwu could not contain his excitement. He stood in the corridor and read carefully, but his brow gradually furrowed. After a long time, he said quietly, Master Fan, there are many things in here that even the court does not know about. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that he could not hide it from Xan Qiwu, but he had trained his composure for over 10 years, ever since he arrived in the capital. His expression did not change. He smiled. There are some things that I cannot say. One of the most important things about being an official was to pretend to be mysterious. As expected, Xan Qiwu did not pursue the matter. Instead, he smiled warmly. If this negotiation is successful, I will certainly write to His Majesty and guarantee you a great service. Fan Xian smiled, bowed and excused himself. Xan Qiwu watched Fan Xian's green-robed silhouette disappear into the courtyard, and a look of confusion appeared on his face. He was close to the crown prince, and naturally knew that Count Sinan held a private power that belonged to His Majesty. But this power had never been displayed on the political stage of the Kingdom of Qin. Could it be that Fan Xian dared to use it just because of Fan Xian? He had never connected Fan Xian to the Overwatch Council. After all, the Overwatch Council was His Majesty's private spy agency. Even the princes could not interfere, much less the illegitimate son of an official. Sitting in the sedan chair, Xan Qiwu rested his chin on his hand and pondered. After the sedan chair stopped, he looked at the tall red palace wall outside. It seemed that his advice to the crown prince had been correct. As for the Fan family, they could only be roped in, not attacked. Chapter 126. Within the Eastern Palace, there were two factions of opinion. The faction that opposed Xan Qiwu believed that since the Fan family of Count Sinan had a good relationship with King Jing, and now had a marriage alliance with the Prime Minister, Crown Prince Jing was a close friend of the second prince, and the Prime Minister was gradually distancing himself from the Eastern Palace, the Fan family must be on the second prince's side. Xan Qiwu firmly opposed this view, because in his view, Fan Jian was not an ordinary official who would follow the Prime Minister's lead. In the depths of the palace, Xan Qiwu obediently knelt in the doorway of the study, his buttocks raised high. Fortunately, his official robes covered it so it did not look ugly. Rise. The emperor's voice came from behind the curtains. Xan Qiwu stood up, his arms hanging by his side, not daring to move. He had been to this study a few times, but he still could not get used to the natural pressure. 2 soybean-sized beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. He did not know if it was because of the summer heat or because he was nervous, but he did not dare to wipe them away. The sound of paper flipping rang out from behind the curtains. After a long silence, the emperor lightly said, "This statement is reasonable and well-founded." Very good. Since that mother in the north is still not willing to settle down, then that's good. You have to help me open my mouth wider. Xan Qiwu replied loudly, "Yes, Your Majesty." The emperor's voice suddenly became strange. "Assistant Minister Fan's son is now your deputy?" Xan Qiwu did not expect His Majesty to be so concerned about Fan Jian. A few more beads of sweat rolled down his forehead, and he respectfully replied, "Yes." The emperor seemed to be very interested in this matter. "Oh, this Fan Xian, I made him a functionary in Taichung Temple. Why did you want to transfer him to Honglu Temple?" Although His Majesty's voice was still gentle, Xan Qiwu was so nervous that he almost fainted. He did not dare to hide anything and answered honestly, "A few days ago, Your Majesty ordered me to lecture in the Eastern Palace, and I spoke with the Crown Prince about the Northern Qi envoy. Because Fan Xian is related to this matter, and because he is famous in the capital, the Northern Qi envoy has Zhuang Mohan, and the court needs a scholar to receive him. So I ventured to suggest this and Your Majesty agreed." Yes. Behind the curtain, the emperor admired this official's frank attitude. He had never been afraid of people forming cliques in the court, but this clique had to be formed in the open. "If there is no mistake in this matter, I will give you full authority to handle this matter. Even if it is the crown prince, you do not need to ask." "Yes." Xan Chiwu had never thought of hiding his relationship with the crown prince from His Majesty. After all, he was the person appointed by His Majesty to serve in the Eastern Palace. The Emperor flipped through the file again, faintly frowning. How did Fan Xian do? Xan Chiwu did not dare to be greedy and replied honestly, "The dossier that Your Majesty is looking at is the result of Deputy Fan's analysis." Analysis? For some reason, the Emperor's tone became a little angry. This is getting more and more ridiculous. Xan Chiwu did not know why His Majesty was angry and was terrified. Fortunately, this matter did not seem to have much to do with the negotiation. After he left the study, His Majesty lifted the curtain and walked out. On his face there was a trace of anger, but also a trace of helplessness. He ordered the eunuch beside him, "Summon Qin Pingping to the palace." The eunuch accepted the order and left. The master of the kingdom of Qing, the most powerful man in the world, walked out of his study and stood in the hallway of the palace. He looked at the dim moon and the corners of his lips curled up. He said to himself, "The most powerful weapon of the nation, and instead of directly assisting the office of the Grand Herald, you use it as a stepping stone for a child's advancement. Well done, Qin Pingping. It looks like if I don't teach you a lesson, you really will give my courtyard to that child to play with." What kind of person was the emperor? From the file that claimed to be the result of Fan Xian's analysis, he could immediately see the shadow of the Overwatch Council. But looking at his expression, he did not seem to be angry, only a little amused. Xan Chiwu's attempt to have the crown prince win over the Fan family was actually in line with the emperor's thoughts. The Eastern Palace had finally shown some political wisdom, and the crown prince seemed to have improved. This fact made the emperor feel slightly gratified. In the Eastern Palace, a fierce quarrel had broken out. The two sides of the quarrel were Xan Chiwu from the office of the Grand Herald and Guo Baoquan, the of the palace. The content of the quarrel was naturally related to the 8th-level official called Fan Xian. Looking at the red faces of both sides, it was obvious how intense the quarrel had been. Xan Chiwu looked at Guo Baoquan with a hint of disdain. "As an official, I have to be frank. I have come to assist the Crown Prince on His Majesty's orders, in order to help the Crown Prince plan for 1,000 years, and to choose a good talent. Functionary Fan Xian has a reputation for talent in the capital. Looking at his recent actions, he knows when to advance and when to retreat. He has real talent, and the Fan family has always been a loyal subject of the royal family. Of course, the Crown Prince should condescend to accept such an official, and not turn him away just because of a moment's anger." Guo Baoquan sneered, "Does Lord Shaoqing think that I only remember that punch? Don't forget the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's Manor, and that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Don't you know the Prime Minister's direction?" Xan Chiwu straightened his neck and said, "I don't know. I only know that the kingdom of Qing only has one emperor, and the kingdom of Qing only has one crown prince. Any attempt to divide the kingdom into factions is extremely foolish." He was not a man with only great ambitions but no skills. Of course, he knew that the second prince had recently become popular, but in terms of strategy, he still believed that the Eastern Palace did not need to treat the second prince as an opponent. Once that happened, it would open a dangerous door. As long as the crown prince remained upright and righteous, there would be no enemies to speak of. The crown prince, who was sitting high above, sighed. He was indeed lecherous and cowardly, but he was not an idiot. In the depths of his heart, he knew that if he looked at the bigger picture, Xan Shaoqing's view was undoubtedly correct. But politics had always been a battle to the death. Even if he was careful, who could guarantee that his two brothers who were eyeing the throne would not do something? The situation at hand has not reached that point. The crown prince rubbed his temples and said with some annoyance, "After all, I am the heir to the throne. It is my duty to reserve talents for the court. As for my brother, don't talk nonsense. That would be too absurd." This was the helplessness of the royal palace. It was clear that they were on guard against each other, but no one could say anything verbally. What about Fan Xian? Guo Baoquan still did not want to give up. Xan Chiwu snorted and said, "Master Guo, I think you have been misjudging one thing." "What is it?" the crown prince asked curiously. "Many officials, including you, have put the Fan family under the second prince's faction because of the relationship between Fan Manor and King Jing's Manor. But who can prove this? This edict from the Eastern Palace has given Fan Xian a chance to shine. If the Fan family is really as Master Guo says, I'm afraid they would not dare accept this mission." Xan Chiwu continued coldly, "The most important thing is that Fan Xian is about to become the Prime Minister's son-in-law. Master Guo's judgment that Fan Xian will not be loyal to the Crown Prince is absurd. What's absurd about it? Guobaoquan's eyes flashed with viciousness. Whether it's in court or in secret, it all shows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess and is trying to break away from the palace's influence. As the Prime Minister of a country, he should not be controlled by the people in the palace. Xan Chiwu came to his senses and bowed to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince shook his head indifferently and signaled for him to continue. Xan Chiwu continued, "What Master Gui said earlier is where the problem lies. Everyone knows that the Prime Minister has broken off relations with the eldest princess. But what does this have to do with the Eastern Palace? Does this mean that the Prime Minister is no longer loyal to His Majesty? Is he no longer on His Highness's side?" The Crown Prince frowned. "But, my aunt has been very angry with the Prime Minister lately. Your Highness, forgive me for being presumptuous, but you cannot change your attitude towards the Prime Minister because of the eldest princess's attitude." Xan Chiwu was neither servile nor overbearing. The Crown Prince's frown deepened. "But," he wanted to say something but stopped. Guobaoquan took this opportunity to speak coldly. "But if the Prime Minister is still the same as before, why hasn't he come to the Eastern Palace to pay his respects after the recent court meetings?" Xan Chiwu smiled confidently and replied, "I did not deny that. Your Highness, this is only an arrangement. It is far from a competition of strength between the two sides. Truly intelligent officials will naturally stick closely to His Majesty. This is enough to ensure the longevity of their families. The Prime Minister is the same. He may be wavering between the Crown Prince and the Second Prince, but in the end he will still listen to His Majesty's orders. If we want the Prime Minister to truly stand on our side." He took a deep breath. "The key lies in Fan Xian. The Prime Minister no longer has a true son. Fan Xian is the future of the Lin family. If we can get Fan Xian to pledge allegiance to Your Highness, the Prime Minister's attitude will naturally change." Guobaoquan snorted. "Don't forget the relationship between Crown Prince Jing and Fan Xian. And don't forget who worked for the person we found out a few days ago," Xan Chiwu said coldly. "That person deliberately let Fan Xian and Your Highness run into each other. Naturally, he hoped that Your Highness would remember the grudge from a few days ago and humiliate Fan Xian so that Fan Xian would truly join his side. Fortunately, Your Highness is wise. Naturally, you will not fall for such a despicable person's trick." The Crown Prince smiled warmly, somewhat pleased. If the Fan family is really on his side, why would he need to use such a trick? Xan Chiwu continued, "I believe that with the Fan family's power, they will certainly find out the truth behind this matter. If they do find out that person did it, I fear that Fan Xian will bear a grudge. So we do not need to worry about the Fan family's current attitude." The Crown Prince was somewhat moved. He said softly, "If the Fan family is still in the dark and has fallen for that person's trick, I might as well tell them. Taking in Fan Xian is the same as taking in the Fan family and the Lin family. The two great powers in the capital, the civil officials and the nobles, at least half of the people look to these two families. And in a few years, I'm afraid that even the palace treasury will be managed by this young man." Xan Chiwu said softly to the Crown Prince, "An 8th-rank official can bring more than a few poems to the people of the capital." Chapter 127. The Crown Prince was moved. After a while he finally made up his mind. He slapped the desk and said, "Very well, I will give Fan Xian a chance. I hope he will not disappoint me." The Eastern Palace's plan was set. Guobaoquan was sad, Xan Chiwu was excited, and the Crown Prince felt that he was wise and tolerant. But none of them knew that the Empress and eldest princess had once tried to assassinate Fan Xian. The true power behind the Eastern Palace had already clashed with Fan Xian twice, once in Danzhou and once in Yolan Street and at the foot of Tsang Mountain. Of course, they had no way of knowing that a few years later, things would become so absurd and inconceivable. The night in the royal palace was always more distant and dark than in other places. It hid all the truth in the past, and made it impossible to see what kind of face would appear in the near future. With the Overwatch Council's intelligence as their backing, the negotiations over the next few days suddenly changed. Northern Qi still wanted to use the sticky candy tactic to drag things out day by day, hoping to wear down the patience of the Qing court. Who would have thought that the powerful vice minister of the Honglu Temple, Xan Chiwu, would become even more ferocious over the past 2 days at the negotiation table? His aura had transformed into a mountain-splitting axe, chopping down on the other party again and again. After 3 rounds of negotiations, issues such as the exchange of prisoners, tribute and titles were all resolved. All that was left was the difficult bone to chew, the redrawing of the borders between the vassal states. As the assistant envoy, Fan Xian watched the entire process with cold eyes. He greatly admired Xn Xiaoqing's knowledge and charisma. He had not expected the crown prince to be surrounded by more than just ordinary people. Not everyone in the Eastern Palace was as annoying as Guo Baoquan. Xian Qiwu, in his free time during the negotiations, also had time to communicate with Fan Xian or observe him in secret. He was surprised that Fan Xian, so young, was able to maintain his composure. He increasingly felt that he could not see through this young nobleman. Overall, the negotiations went smoothly. Aside from the Overwatch Council's help in compiling the dossier, Fan Xian did not do much. But in the future, when it came to rewards, he would always be missing a share, so Fan Xian was very satisfied with his current life. The bookstore was managed by Qingyu Hall's 7th Yi shopkeeper, and Fan Xijia often worked as an accountant, so there was no need for him to worry about it. Naturally, the women of the Lin and Fan manors were busy preparing for the wedding in 2 months. Even Lady Lu was very happy with the fact that Fan Xian was going to be the fake son-in-law. She played the role of a stepmother and was very busy. After all, if he married the emperor's adopted daughter, Fan Xian would probably not inherit the title of nobility. Furthermore, Lin Wanner had another identity. The old spinsters in the palace often came to the manor to make irresponsible remarks. Every few days, there would be an edict from one of the concubines, causing Count Sinan and Fan Jian to be badly battered. For Fan Xian, who had no understanding of the etiquette of the palace, these things were naturally avoided as much as possible. It was just that Lin Wanner and Ruoruo, who were helping their brother carry the ceremony, had to spend every day immersed in this pain. The second prince had asked Crown Prince Jing to speak on his behalf twice, wanting to invite Fan Xian for a meeting. But the encounter with the Crown Prince during the summer vacation had left a shadow in Fan Xian's heart, so he pushed it back to the end of the month, hoping that things would have calmed down by then. After all, it seemed that the Eastern Palace's attitude toward Fan Manor had changed. It wasn't that he dared to refuse the prince's invitation, but that he had used a good name. When he was working for the country, he dared not linger in Flower Alley. During these days, the only thing that worried him was Zhuang Mohan of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission, who had been living in seclusion, and Sigu Jian's first disciple of the Dongyi diplomatic mission. Of these two, one was a scholar and the other a warrior. Both were top figures in the world. It was a bit too quiet in the capital. Zhuang Mohan had been invited by the Empress Dowager to stay in the palace to give lectures, while Sigu Jian's head disciple, Yun Jilan, had remained with the diplomatic mission. Fan Xian paid the most attention to Yun Jilan. After all, Zhuang Mohan's reputation as a scholar did not conflict with Fan Xian's, while Yun Jilan had taken his life. But in the capital of the kingdom of Qin, Fan Xian believed that Yun Jilan would not be so stupid as to seek vengeance on him alone. So what really bothered Fan Xian was a key. At night, he stared at the black leather case in a daze. The lock looked to be made of brass, but he had tried it before. Even the slender dagger that Fei Jia had left behind could not make a mark on it. It seemed that the material was strange. Behind the brass keyhole, there seemed to be some sort of mechanism, but if he could not obtain the key, he would not even be able to see what the mechanism looked like. Fan Xian had once tried to find some way to get to know Eunuch Hong of the palace, but after a few attempts, he realized something. Although he seemed to be doing very well in the capital, there was still a long way to go before he reached the top of the world. The Crown Prince and the second prince wanted to rope him in because of the Fan and Lin manors behind him. It was not because of anything special about him and the area around the palace, because he did not need to look at the officials. He had no way of getting in touch with them. It was also not convenient for Wanner to enter the palace often, so there was no one who could help him. Even if he wanted to get to know Hong Xixiang, it would be difficult, not to mention that he had to do as Uncle Wu Zhu said and keep him outside the palace for 2 hours. When the second prince used Crown Prince Li Hongqing to invite Fan Xian, he had cleverly used the mouths of others to see if he could get to know Eunuch Hong, but Li Hongqing shook his head. That old dog would only lie in the shade of the Empress Dowager's palace, and would never leave the palace. It looks like I have to change my plan. With a thud, Fan Xian kicked the case back onto the bed. Looking at Wu Zhu, who seemed to be asleep in the corner, he said, "I have no way of dragging Eunuch Hong out." Wu Zhu slowly raised his head. "I can lure him out, or you can try to find the key in the palace." Fan Xian was shocked. With his average ability of between the 4th level and the 6th level, did he want to die in the palace? But he narrowed his eyes and felt that this seemed to be a more feasible path. Uncle Wu Zhu always said that his power was only at the 3rd level, but he was able to kill Qing Jushu. It seemed that Wu Zhu's calculation ability was too strong, and so he underestimated his ability to use Jinqi. Of course, this was not something Fan Xian could say. If it really is too dangerous, why do I need this key? This was a question that had been lingering in Fan Xian's mind for a long time. If it's just out of curiosity, it doesn't seem worth it to take such a big risk. Don't you want to know what the lady left for you? I do. Fan Xian sat on the bed, his head slightly lowered. But I think that mother must want me to be happy, safe, and live happily in this world. If she put her son in danger because she wanted to know what she left for him, perhaps mother would not want it. Wu Zhu also lowered his head, the black cloth covering his eyes blending into the darkness around him. Although he was not looking at Fan Xian still felt a chill. You are very satisfied with your current life. Wu Zhu's voice was very cold. As always, he rarely asked questions. He was just calmly stating a fact. Fan Xian was startled. After he entered the capital, especially in the period after summer, he seemed to really enjoy the power, wealth, and stability that came with being the son of a noble family. But you cannot control your own life. Wu Zhu continued speaking coldly. Everything before you is constructed according to the plans of Qin Pingping and Fan Jian. Fan Xian felt a chill in his heart. He understood what Wu Zhu meant. But even though he had lived 2 lives and thought he had seen the coldness and treachery of the world, he still did not dare believe this kind of judgment. He lowered his voice and said, "Can you not even trust them?" Wu Zhu's voice became even colder. "It is my habit to trust no one. That kind of life will be very difficult." Fan Xian closed his eyes as if he was simulating an eternal life in the dark. "After they die, what will you do?" Wu Zhu rarely asked a question, and this one hit Fan Xian where it hurt. Fan Xian frowned and said, "I understand." Wu Zhu ignored his expression and continued speaking without a trace of emotion. "The only thing that can protect you is not conspiracy, not power, not anything else. It is only power. You must remember this." Fan Xian stood up from the side of the bed and bowed respectfully toward this servant, this teacher, this elder brother. "I do not know what the lady left you in the box, but I do know that you must have enough power to protect yourself and intimidate your enemies. Determination is also a kind of power, so I want you to find that key." "Yes, I will take care of it immediately." When Fan Xian raised his head, he found that Wu Zhu had once again disappeared into the night. In the 10 years they had spent together, Wu Zhu rarely spoke so much in one go, other than on rainy nights when he thought of his mother. Fan Xian understood what Wu Zhu meant. The prosperity of the capital was bone-crushing and soul-consuming. It had indeed caused the calmness and strength that he had honed since he was young to show signs of weakness. This was a warning to him not to rely too much on the so-called power of his family and the legacy of his mother. These days, although he had worked hard to cultivate the tyrannical Jinqi in his body and to familiarize himself with the 3 poisonous needles, it was as Wu Zhu had said. His heart was not as strong as it had been in Danzhou. The only thing that can protect each and every one of us is our own strength. A child without a mother is like a blade of grass. Even the grass has to run out of the cracks in the rock. Ignore the sun and the rain. Take root deeper and make your stem sturdier. That is the right path. Chapter 128. The sky in the east had already turned red. The sun slowly rose from the sleepy clouds and shone on the capital's grandest buildings. The outer walls of the palace were even redder than the sky. They calmly and terrifyingly watched the crowd in the square in front of them. Fan Xian was also one of these people. He looked at the tall palace walls and the bottomless doorway at the bottom of the wall. He felt that this dark place was very much like the mouth of a monster. He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of nervousness. Fan Xian, like everyone else in the world, still felt a sense of awe when faced with this solemn symbol of imperial power. But awe didn't mean obedience, and it didn't mean no resistance. This was where he was different from everyone else. After the guards at the palace gate examined them, they nodded with a trace of arrogance. Fan Xian and his group obediently walked in. Today was the day of the festival, and the palace had issued an edict to summon an 8th-level functionary into the palace. The edict had arrived yesterday, and Fan Manor had been busy all night before deciding on the number of people to enter the palace. Naturally, Fan Jian wouldn't go. There were few women in Count Sinan's manor, so a few distant relatives of the Fan clan in the capital had come forward to volunteer. Fan Xian had never seen such excitement before, and Fan Jian coldly put an end to everyone's thoughts. In the end, it was decided that Lady Lu and Fan Ruoruo would accompany Fan Xian into the palace, along with 2 old nannies. These 2 old nannies had been around his grandmother's time in Danzhou, and were very familiar with the rules of the palace. Lady Lu's willingness to follow Fan Xian into the palace was somewhat unexpected to Fan Xian. He knew that although Lady Lu had never been promoted, She had in fact been in contact with some of the nobles in the palace since she was a child. Their relationship was not ordinary. With her by his side, Fan Xian's trip to the palace would probably be much smoother. The sound of light and hurried footsteps echoed in the quiet doorway. The doorway was so deep that the rising sun could only illuminate half of it. The other half was particularly dark. A cold wind suddenly blew out from the palace walls, making it difficult for everyone to keep their eyes open. The weather of August and September suddenly had a hint of the chilly late autumn. Fan Xian subtly touched his belt and felt the pills that were smaller than soybeans. He felt a little more at ease. He knew that the checks for entering the palace were particularly strict, so before he left the manor, he hid his secret crossbow and dagger in his room. However, Uncle Wu Zhu's lecture had left a deep impression on him. Even though he was in the royal palace, the safest place in the world, he still prepared a few life-saving tricks. Ta 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 ta. Man is a very strange animal and people are a very strange group. Walking under the quiet palace walls, the footsteps of the group of 6 people gradually became synchronized. They landed on the ground at the same time and raised their feet at the same time. Following the little eunuch in the lead, they sounded the same monotonous syllable as if they were playing a 4-string zither at the same time. A wave of discomfort welled up in Fan Xian's heart. He forced himself to pause and let his footsteps stagger with the others. The synchronized footsteps under the palace walls were immediately broken. He gently pulled his sister's sleeve and said in a low voice, "I'm a little nervous." Fan Ruoruo smiled and wanted to give him some encouragement. But the little eunuch in front of them turned his head and looked at Fan Xian with a frown. He seemed a little dissatisfied. Lady Lu frowned and said quietly, "The palace is not like other places. Be careful what you say." The little eunuch wasn't handsome and he had a worried look on his face. Hearing Countess Sinan's words, he suddenly felt that he had gained some glory. Where was this? This was the royal palace. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He hadn't expected Lady Lu to continue with a smile. But there's no need to be nervous. I've been in this palace since I was a child. At that time Eunuch Hong was the leader of the eunuchs. In the blink of an eye, it's little children who serve in the palace. Hearing this, the little eunuch in front of him didn't dare put on airs. He hurriedly walked into the palace. He had thought he was bringing some country bumpkins into the palace, but it turned out to be acquaintances visiting relatives. The royal palace was enormous. After the long entrance to the city, there was a large square made of bluestone, which made one feel suddenly enlightened. The early morning sun shone on the roof of the Taiji Palace's main hall, and the yellow glazed tiles reflected a dazzling luster. There was a large column several meters away from the hall, and the long stone steps in front of the hall looked like a white jade road leading to the Milky Way. Fan Xian squinted at the building in front of him, and a sense of absurdity welled up in his heart. He wondered if he had arrived at the palace museum. Perhaps this sense of absurdity diluted his nervousness and his sense of estrangement from the unfamiliar palace. For the rest of the journey, Fan Xian finally returned to his natural demeanor. He looked a little like he had when he first entered Fan Manor. His face was full of smiles, and he looked around at the palace maids and eunuchs with their heads bowed as they walked along the palace walls. Occasionally he raised his head to look at the eaves in the distance, but he didn't know which palace it was and he didn't know who lived there. The young eunuch shook his head, but a faintly discernible smile floated on Lady Lu's lips. She thought to herself, this eldest young master really has a personality that fears neither the heavens nor the earth. The purpose of entering the palace today was simple. The concubines in the palace wanted to see what the talented Fan Xian who was about to marry China looked like. Although the purpose was simple, the process was particularly complicated. So everyone in Fan Manor got up early, washed up and dressed up. They rushed into the palace as soon as the palace doors opened, and then waited in a corner room, waiting for one of the concubines to summon them. Those who were summoned could wait, but the concubines in the palace were not willing to wait. Because he had gotten up so early, Fan Xian sat in the corner room, drinking the palace's fine tea. He was still sleepy and his spirit was not good. Lady Lu glanced at him and stood up with a smile. She said to the eunuch who had come to greet them in the palace, "Eunuch Ho, long time no see." As she said this, she extended her finger and handed over the banknotes without the slightest hint of anger. Fan Xian peeked and the corners of his lips curled up. He almost laughed. His aunt's methods had indeed been influenced by his father, and she relied on banknotes to beat people. Unexpectedly, Eunuch Ho looked embarrassed and respectfully said, "Lady Fan, aren't you slapping me in the face? You grew up with the masters in the palace and I wouldn't dare beg for food here." Hearing this, Lady Lu couldn't help but laugh. This is a reward for you, not a purchase. Were you afraid of? Eunuch Ho chuckled, and the wrinkles on his face squeezed together. He said quietly, they know you're entering the palace today, and there's no reason for them to keep you waiting for too long. Don't worry, it's just that it's too early and I'm afraid they're all busy washing up. I'll just sit for a bit. Fan Xian's ears twitched, and he realized that the old eunuch was referring to Lady Lu as Lady Fan. It seemed that the palace was already leaning towards Lady Lu's promotion. He also heard that the various palaces were still cleaning the courtyards in the morning. He had originally felt that he had woken up too early and had come too early. Hearing this, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Fortunately, Eunuch Ho was right. Count Sinon was wise to have Lady Lu accompany him to the palace. Before the morning court had even begun, the 3 members of the Fan family had already entered the rear palace. The 2 old nannies were received outside, and there was good tea and water. They were old people who had been in the palace for a long time, and they didn't mind the boredom. The first to go was to Yigui Pin. She was the mother of the 3rd prince, and because she was a mother who relied on her son's status, she was promoted from a talented person to a Gui Pin. Fan Xian bowed respectfully and then heard a gentle voice. Rise. Yigui Pin was born plain and clean, but that was all. She was not at all as beautiful as Fan Xian had imagined. Much to Fan Xian's surprise, Lady Lu looked at Yigui Pin with moist eyes. After the 2 women bowed, they held hands and looked at each other, speechless. Fan Xian looked at his sister with a puzzled expression. Ruoro's face was calm and she was not at all surprised. After listening to them talk for a while, Fan Xian realized that Yigui Pin was actually Lady Lu's cousin. Fan Xian was incomparably shocked. Only now did he realize that the Lu family had such deep roots. Fortunately, he had carried out a policy of appeasement after entering the capital, and Lady Lu had treated him kindly. Otherwise, if the 2 of them had really clashed, who knew who would have died? Why haven't you come to the palace to see me? Yigui Pin wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes. It's been 4 years, and you have the heart to leave me alone in the palace. It wasn't easy to get an edict to summon you to the palace to talk with me. Who knew you wouldn't come? You've really depressed me to death. A trace of sadness flashed across Lady Lu's face. She didn't speak for a while. After a while, she said quietly, it's my fault. It's all my fault. She didn't look at Fan Xian, but Fan Xian looked at Lady Lu's slightly thin shoulders. A strange light flashed in his eyes. Hearing Yigui Pin speak of 4 years, he very sensitively thought of the assassination attempt in Danzhou. According to his father, Lady Lu was only a scapegoat for the assassination attempt. The real masterminds behind the scenes were the 2 most noble women in the palace. Was that the reason Lady Lu hadn't entered the palace for 4 years? In the future, I will often come to the palace to see you. Lady Lu smiled warmly and took Yigui Pin's hand. Didn't I come today? Yigui Pin's anger turned into a smile. If it weren't for the fact that the young master of the Fan family is going to marry the most precious girl in the palace, I wouldn't have hoped to see you. She turned to Fan Xian and asked gently, you are Fan Xian? Fan Xian hurriedly stood up. His elegant face was filled with the warmest of smiles. He bowed to the ground. Nephew Fan Xian greets Aunt Lu. This was against the rules. The palace maids and eunuchs were stunned. Lady Lu was also a little surprised. She thought to herself, I'm not your real mother. But Fan Xian shamelessly claimed a relationship. Clearly Yigui Pin, who was tired of the rules of the palace, liked it. She looked at Fan Xian and beamed. You really are a good child. Chapter 129. There were many ridiculous things in this world, but to be judged as a good child after saying only 8 words, even Fan Xian, who was almost 17 years old, felt that this matter was ridiculous to the extreme. This palace was indeed different from other places. The judgments of the high and mighty nobles seemed to be too arbitrary and dependent on their own preferences. Although Fan Xian did not know the relationship between Lady Lu and Yigui Pin, it did not prevent him from learning from Wanner that Yigui Pin was a highly favored concubine. Otherwise, she would not have been able to give birth to an 8-year-old prince, despite the emperor's reputation of cultivating his moral character and keeping away from women. As they chatted in the palace, Yigui Pin seemed to really like Fan Xian. The expression on her face grew happier and happier. Fan Xian was tactful and picked out a few jokes he remembered from his previous life to listen to them. Suddenly, there was a burst of bell-like laughter in the palace hall. Fan Xian found that Lady Gui Pin's temperament was straightforward and ruthless. He did not know how she was able to maintain such a temperament in this shameful palace. He could not help but be surprised and admire her. After chatting for a while, the sun had already gradually risen. Lady Lu smiled and asked, "Where is the third prince?" Iguipin sighed and said, "That child is still very afraid of strangers. As soon as he wakes up, he shrinks himself in the back of the palace and doesn't want to come out. I'm afraid he won't show his face until it's time to eat." Lady Lu laughed and said, "It turns out that our third prince is quite shy." Although there was a difference between master and subject, Lady Lu and Iguipin were still sisters, so their words were not as particular. Iguipin stretched out her slender index finger. Her nails were painted red and looked very attractive. She pointed at Fan Xian and said, "Isn't this one of yours also shy?" At that moment, a shy smile appeared on Fan Xian's face, just in response to Iguipin's words. "Well, sister, you and Ruoruo can stay here and chat with me." Iguipin seemed to know that Lady Lu did not want to go to the Empress and the eldest princess, so she made the decision to keep them as guests. "I will let Xinger take Fan Xian to those palaces." Madame Lu's expression darkened slightly. She bowed and said, "How can this be done? Today I received the imperial edict to enter the palace and be the first to see Guipin Nyang. I was originally worried that I would offend those Nyang. If I enter the palace and don't visit those Nyang, I'm afraid it would be somewhat disrespectful." Hearing these words, Guipin snorted and said, "Sister, I think it's best if you don't go. Originally it was just to summon Fan Xian into the palace. You should keep me company and talk. I want to see who in the palace dares to make irresponsible remarks." Iguipin was a cheerful noblewoman with a trace of naivety, but when she lost her temper, she still appeared very dignified. The entire palace quieted down. Fan Xian coughed lightly and said, "Auntie? Second madam, I will go by myself. You and my sister can keep Aunt Lu company and talk for a while." Hearing him say this, Madame Lu had no choice but to agree. She and the serving girl called Xing escorted Fan Xian outside the palace. In a quiet voice, she warned him of a few things to take note of, and without anyone noticing, she moved to Fan Xian's shoulder. In a voice as quiet as a mosquito, she said, "Everyone in the palace has been informed. There will be people in each palace to receive you. Don't be too nervous." Fan Xian's heart trembled and he complied. Turning around, he saw that his sister had followed him out, looking at him encouragingly. For some reason, his heart was filled with warmth. He smiled and thought, when a mother-in-law looks at a son-in-law, the more she looks at him, the more she likes him. Furthermore, I was born with such a beautiful body. Dealing with a few resentful women in the palace should be a piece of cake. After the candidate for the emperor's son-in-law had left Iguipin's palace, Madame Lu said a few words to Fan Ruoruo, and then entered the inner chambers with Iguipin. Iguipin quietly looked into her eyes and said, "For years ago, I advised you not to listen to the advice of those two palaces. Now Fan Xian is still alive and well, but you have chilled Sir Fan's heart. Sister, you have been intelligent your whole life. How could you have made such a mistake?" Madame Lu stood where she was, speechless for a long time. Her eyes gradually became resentful and she quietly said, "You also know that as mothers, don't we think for our children? The third prince is still young, so you can stay out of it. In a few years, I'm afraid you will understand why I made such a big mistake." Xinger was a young girl of about 13 or 14 years of age. As they walked through the palace, Fan Xian noticed that the girl's head was always lowered. He couldn't help but tease her. "Can't you see where you're going?" Xinger giggled, revealing her small teeth. "Master Fan, it's best not to talk too much in the palace." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He knew that there were many rules in the palace, but he didn't think that even a young girl would be so cautious and self-restrained. Fan Xian followed behind Xinger, looking at the clothes she wore. His eyes swept over the girl's undeveloped waist, and then immediately turned to the buildings of the palace. There was a smile on his face, but his brain was working quickly, trying to memorize the complicated scenery of the road in his mind, in preparation for that matter in the future. As they walked, they passed by flowers and trees and stepped on stones and grass. Although the palace was large, there was a time when they would arrive. Although there were many palaces, not all of them were so grand that they could shake one's heart. Looking at the quiet courtyard in front of him, Fan Xian took a deep breath and followed Xinger inside. This was the residence of the second prince's birth mother, imperial concubine Shu. This imperial concubine seemed to love peace and quiet. The courtyard was also decorated very simply and elegantly. Apart from a few pink flowering trees, there were no other decorations. A bamboo curtain covered everything inside, but it could not hide the fragrance of books seeping out from the curtains. Greetings, concubine Shu. Master Fan, please sit. Without exchanging pleasantries, Fan Xian and concubine Shu sat apart from the curtain. Without any warning, concubine Shu suddenly asked in a clear voice, 10,000 miles of sorrowful autumn, always a guest. Master Fan, when you were young you were often in Danzhou. Do you think the capital is only a place for guests? Fan Xian was a bit surprised, but he answered with a straight face. Using this as a starting point, he and concubine Shu sat down and discussed the Tao. They talked about all the classics and poems in the world, until their mouths were a bit dry. Only then did they tacitly stop talking. Fan Xian felt some lingering fear. He really didn't think that the second prince's mother was a talented woman of the palace. She was so knowledgeable that he almost couldn't deal with her. He couldn't help but think, what kind of person would a prince be raised by such a woman? Don't be nervous. Concubine Shu's temperament was very gentle. Through the bamboo curtain, he could faintly see that there was only a wooden fork on her head. She was so plain that she was out of place in the palace. Grew up in the palace. Before His Majesty took her as his adopted daughter, we had nothing to do, so we raised her like a daughter. There is no one in the palace who doesn't like her. So if Master Fan wants to marry the most precious pearl of the palace, we can't help but watch. Fan Xian's back was covered in a cold sweat. Although he usually had some understanding, it was only today that he truly felt his fiancée's position in the palace. Concubine Shu was gentle and light. She seemed to be quite satisfied with Fan Xian's way of talking. After a while she let Fan Xian leave. But before they parted she said quietly, I like to read and His Majesty has collected some rare books for me. I have already let the palace servants select some of the precious ones and make copies. Master Fan, if you want to go to the other concubines I will have them sent to Yigui Pin. Fan Xian's heart trembled. He knew that this was a generous gift. He knew that this concubine was giving it on behalf of the second prince. He didn't dare to say anything more. He calmly bowed and left. After leaving concubine Shu's courtyard, Fan Xian wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The palace maid leading the way, Xing was a little familiar with him. She walked on her tiptoes, hopping and skipping. She looked back at his expression and asked curiously, It's not hot today? Fan Xian smiled bitterly and shook his head. He had thought that entering the palace today was just a courtesy visit. He didn't know that it was even more tense than the palace examination. Presumably, the concubines in the palace were very curious about Lin Wanner marrying him, so they wanted to see Fan Xian's literary and martial talents. Next, the two of them went to the great prince's birth mother, Ning the Talented. Fan Xian knew that although this woman's position was not high, and she was only a talented person, he knew from Wanner that it was because she was from Dongyi. So Fan Xian purposely treated her with respect. Ning the Talented was nearly 40 years old, but she still retained her charm. Her expression was very gentle, like that of a Dongyi woman. These years the great prince had been in Chushu and she had no one. It was inevitable that she would be lonely. Fortunately, when Lin Wanner was in the palace she often came here to play, so her feelings for Wanner were not the same as those of the other concubines. She looked at Fan Xian coldly. Her phoenix eyes were cold. You are Fan Xian. Fan Xian knew that this noble lady had once saved the emperor on the battlefield, and had raised a prince who was good at war. She was certainly a very dignified person, so he wasn't surprised. He calmly replied, I am. Ning the Talented looked him up and down. Unexpectedly she didn't say anything. She only coldly said, Treat Wanner well. Fan Xian liked this clean and efficient feeling. He happily replied, Please do not worry, concubine. That incident on Yolan Street must have been strange. I don't believe you could kill an 8th level ace. Ning the Talented looked him up and down and snorted. Looking at your thin and weak appearance, you don't look like someone who is good at fighting. Fan Xian was startled. Could it be that he had just finished taking an exam in literature, and now he was about to take an exam in martial arts? But concubine, you are a 40-year-old lady. There is a difference between master and subject and between men and women. Surely you wouldn't go so far as to beat him with your fists? But since Yi Ling admits that she is no match for you, I will have to make do with it. That's all for today. Go to another palace. Don't waste too much time. Having said this, Ning the Talented had nothing else to say. She chased him out of the palace hall. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head and looked at the tightly shut wooden door. He thought to himself, His Majesty really is a lucky man. The women lying by his side are so colorful. There is Yigui Pin, who is the bright and innocent type, Lady Shu, who is the intellectual and virtuous type, and he even has a wild girlfriend like Ning the Talented. But he already knew that Lady Shu was very talented, and that Ning the Talented was probably a person who was rough on the outside but meticulous on the inside. Add to that the unfathomable Empress, and the fact that His Majesty was able to put all these women in one large room and live in peace for so many years, it had to be said that His Majesty, the Emperor of the Kingdom of Qin, was very powerful. At least, Fan Xian didn't have that kind of ability. Chapter 130. Still walking through the palace, Fan Xian saw a few more ladies, chatted with them, and received a few rewards. He couldn't help but feel a little bored. But he didn't dare show any expression on his face. This was the palace after all. Who knew whose subordinate the eunuch next to him was, and whose confidant the young serving girl plucking the willow branches was? If his annoyance was seen by these people, then they would whisper it to their masters, and their masters would whisper it to the emperor's pillow. Would he feel any better? Even if he and the emperor were friends who had drunk tea and chatted, he could only suffer a blow without being able to defend himself. But thinking of the people he was going to see, Fan Xian's heart had long since calmed down, and there was even a hint of coldness and cruelty. But when he looked at the palace, his eyes were still full of smiles, as if he was very much looking forward to it. Yaohua Palace was much larger than the other palaces and courtyards, highlighting the identity of its owner. The person who lived here was the Empress of the Kingdom of Qin, the motherly model of the world. Fan Xian had not expected that the Empress' summons would end so simply. The Empress smiled warmly, and her words made Fan Xian feel as if he was bathing in a spring breeze. Looking at the Empress' bright and beautiful face, looking at the Empress' eyes that were as calm as water, Fan Xian respectfully responded. His heart was filled with a strange feeling. This elegant and noble woman before him, whose every movement made him feel very comfortable, was actually the person who had wanted to kill him 4 years ago. Kneeling down and kowtowing twice, Fan Xian left Yaohua Palace with a somewhat uneasy expression. His meeting with the Empress had started so simply, and ended so hastily. Seeing how well he had concealed his emotions, and even not showing any strange emotions, it could only mean that the Empress looked at Fan Xian without any unease. Fan Xian smiled, the corners of his lips slightly parted, but his heart was cold. Perhaps in the end he had overestimated his importance. For these nobles in the palace, wanting to kill him 4 years ago was probably a very small matter. Outside the gates of Guangxing Palace, the eunuchs who had followed him carefully moved to the back, not daring to breathe too loudly. The serving girl Xinger was also very conspicuous. In a low voice she said to Fan Xian, "Master Fan, please come in." Fan Xian raised his eyebrows, thinking that if he went in without being summoned, it would be somewhat against the rules. What if he was killed by the eldest princess mother-in-law? Lin Chong had fallen for the same trick back then. But he knew it wasn't that scary today. These eunuchs and maids were just afraid of the eldest princess for no reason. The eldest princess Li Yunrui. Her name had a bit of masculinity, but she was a very weak person. Of course, this was just a facade. She had many identities. She was the de facto controller of the palace treasury, the prime minister's old lover, the emperor's most capable political assistant, a transcendent presence in the harem, and the empress dowager's most beloved daughter. For Fan Xian, the other party actually only had 2 identities. One was an enemy who had once wanted to kill him. The second was his future mother-in-law. Guangxian Palace was cold and gloomy. In broad daylight, the palace doors were naturally not closed. Standing outside the door, one could see some sleeping plum blossoms, heat-averse orchids, old green bamboos, and daisies that had yet to bloom. In the palace, one could see many white muslin curtains fluttering in the wind. The overall feeling was as pure and tender as a fairy tale world. A chill appeared between Fan Xian's brows. It was as if he had been infected by the aura of the palace. A maid in her 20s appeared at the door and bowed slightly to Fan Xian. The maid's eyebrows were extremely long, and her eyes were somewhat cold. But her speech and body movements were still very courteous. She respectfully welcomed Fan Xian into the palace. Muslin. It was all muslin. Fan Xian was a little stunned as he pulled away the white muslin. There were many more muslin curtains in Guangxian Palace than he had seen in the back garden of King Jing's manor. The decorations around him were also a little strange. It didn't match the solemn atmosphere of the palace. It was more like the living quarters of a young girl waiting to be married. At the end of the heavy curtains was a low bed. A woman in a light pink dress was lying on it. She supported her chin with one arm, and her waist naturally revealed a sense of elegance. Her eyebrows and eyes were picturesque, but her expression was timid and lovable. This was the first time Fan Xian had seen his mother-in-law, the eldest princess. Like many people who saw the eldest princess Li Yunrui for the first time, he was dumbfounded. He didn't know if the woman in front of him was real or fake. Was she a figure in a painting or a fairy in the water? The eldest princess was 30 years old, but her demeanor was very much like that of a young girl who had just turned 16. Her eyebrows, and the straight black hair that fell naturally on the arm of the bed, were enough to make any man in the world yearn for her. Fan Xian's face was full of shock. But his strange encounter and the temperament he had trained in Danzhou for 16 years made his mind a sea of calm. But he still had to admit that although his mother-in-law looked like Wan she was much more beautiful. Although Fan Xian could still maintain his calm, he didn't want to call her mother-in-law in his heart. It seemed that calling her that did not match her natural beauty. The eldest princess looked at Fan Xian. That look contained a lot of meaning. She was timid and lovable. She opened her pale lips and said, "Pick up a chair and sit. I have a headache." Fan Xian looked around uneasily. He realized that the eldest princess had said something unnecessary. In the vast Guangxin palace, there was not a single chair. As he was puzzled, he heard the eldest princess say softly, "Minister Fan, I hear that you are skilled in medicine. Wan'er's health has improved greatly these days. It's all thanks to you." Fan Xian quickly bowed. "Eldest princess is too kind. It's all because of the royal doctor's meticulous care. I'm just giving you a few folk remedies." The eldest princess stretched out her slender fingers and rubbed her temples. As her fingertips rubbed, her forehead gradually turned red. "Is there a folk remedy for migraines? I've had a terrible headache these days." The eldest princess had a chronic headache. Fan Xian had heard about this from Wan. Last time, outside the summer estate, he had heard the crown prince mention it. But Fan Xian paid more attention to how the eldest princess addressed him and how she referred to herself. In their few sentences, the eldest princess referred to him as "you" and "me." It seemed particularly intimate. Fan Xian smiled. "There are many kinds of headaches. When my teacher taught here, he had a headache as well." His words were light, but the two headaches were quite interesting. The eldest princess smiled gently and her charm grew. Fan Xian knew that his relationship with Fei Jia was no secret in the capital. There was no way he could hide it from the eldest princess, so he made it clear. "Is there really no good way?" The eldest princess didn't ask about anything else today. Her only concern was the headache. Her face was full of worry and she looked very weak. "These days I've been in so much pain." Fan Xian lowered his eyes slightly and calmed his mind. "I've learned a method of massage. Although it can only treat the symptoms and not the root, it has a soothing effect." The eldest princess's eyes brightened. "Then hurry and try it," she said softly. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. I'm afraid it's a little inconvenient." The eldest princess covered her mouth and giggled. "I didn't think that the famous great scholar Fan in the capital would be such a polite little scholar. Not to mention that this is an emergency, you'll be my son in a few days. What's there to be afraid of?" Fan Xian looked at the eldest princess's youthful demeanor and thought of her true age. He should have felt disgusted, but looking at the eldest princess's tender cheeks and her eyebrows, which were as clear as a young leaf, it was hard to feel disgusted. But hearing the word son, he still laughed coldly in his heart. His face was calm and he replied, "How could I dare disobey the orders of my elders?" A eunuch brought a copper basin of clean water. Fan Xian carefully washed his hands, and then slowly walked to the eldest princess's side. He took a few deep breaths, calming his emotions. He did his best not to let his gaze fall on the eldest princess's white neck, which was slightly exposed under her black hair. He steadily stretched out his hands and placed them on her head. His fingers ran through the eldest princess's black hair. The tip of her hair floated gently, and there was a slight itch. Fan Xian simply closed his eyes, imagining that he was like Wu Zhu, covered with a black cloth. His fingertips touched the eldest princess's hairline, and then gently moved upwards. His thumbs pressed against her temples, and his two index fingers traced along her eyebrows, confirming the position between her eyebrows. He knocked. The eldest princess seemed unprepared. She gave a light grunt, but it was hard to tell whether it was from pain or from where he had pressed. Fan Xian was calm. Relying on his knowledge of the human body's acupuncture points, he slowly and steadily massaged her head. Every time his fingers made contact with Li Yunrui's skin, it was steady. The grand princess frowned, wondering if she had been a little rash. She never thought that this little fellow's technique would be so good. His fingertips seemed to carry a fine stream of air, rubbing the source of her pain. Every time he pressed, it would make her feel much more relaxed. Her mind gradually relaxed and she seemed to slowly feel sleepy. "Did Fei Jie teach you this technique?" she asked casually, her eyes half closed as she leaned against the bed. "Sir Fei taught me how to recognize acupuncture points." Fan Xian's fingers continued to move steadily across her smooth skin. His voice did not tremble in the slightest. "This massage technique, however, was learned by myself. As the saying goes, a long illness makes a doctor. In his previous life, when he was lying on a sickbed in the beginning, he still had a glimmer of hope that he would be able to stand up again. That was why that cute little nurse often massaged his legs and the muscles of his body. But in the end he had given up hope. As for the massage technique, Fan Xian remembered it. Not bad. The eldest princess praised him. She slowly closed her eyes again, enjoying the warm and relaxing feeling brought by the young man's hands. Guangxin Palace was silent. The eldest princess's eyes remained closed. Her long eyelashes rested on her fair skin, trembling slightly. She suddenly said, "If you want to marry Wano, then you must forget what happened 4 years ago." Fan Xian's fingers paused, stopping just below the eldest princess's ear. It seemed ordinary, but it was a fatal acupuncture point. Chapter 131. It was only for a moment, and Fan Xian immediately smiled and began to knead again. His voice, however, was slightly surprised. "4 years ago?" The eldest princess smiled, and the corners of her lips arched into a beautiful curve. She seemed to be secretly admiring this young man. She changed the subject. "When did Fei Jie start teaching you?" Fan Xian knew that she was testing him. His expression did not change and he calmly replied, "That was when I was young." His words were very vague, and the eldest princess could not ask for too much detail due to her status. She said with a faint smile, "If I did not know that Fei Jie was your teacher, I think many people in the palace, including those in the palace, would not know that the Fan family has such a close relationship with the Overwatch Council." Fan Xian's hands became gentler, and his reply became more careful. "I'm not very sure. Perhaps father and Fei Jie knew each other in the past." The eldest princess gently said, "Of course they knew each other. During the first northern expedition your father and Fei Jie were both with the emperor in the army tent. It would be strange to say that they did not know each other. But I was very young back then, so it is even more impossible for you to know about these things." "Yes." Fan Xian knew that the more he said, the more likely he would be to slip up. He smiled and said nothing more. The eldest princess seemed to be in the mood for conversation. She continued to ask, "How is your grandmother?" "She is in good health." "Yes, I have not seen her in a long time," the eldest princess replied weakly. "When I was young, I liked your grandmother the most. Every time my brother wanted to bully me, she was the one who protected me." Fan Xian smiled and thought, "If grandmother knew that you wanted to kill me now, I am afraid she would have taken a wooden stick and beaten you to death. I believe that Sir Fan should have explained His Majesty's intentions clearly to you." The eldest princess's sweet and gentle words suddenly brought up such a serious topic. Comparing the two, it was especially cold. Fan Xian's brows furrowed imperceptibly. He knew that she was talking about the matter of the palace treasury. At this time he could no longer play dumb. All he could do was smile and say, "I will follow His Majesty's arrangements." "I heard that you recently opened a bookstore and a tofu shop in the capital." The eldest princess could not help but smile. With her eyes closed, her smile was as beautiful as ever. The children of aristocratic families are mostly useless people who only know how to talk and do nothing. I admire you for being able to enter this line of work in preparation for taking over the palace treasury in the future. It's just that the matter of the tofu shop was a bit too much. Fan Xian chuckled, not knowing how to deal with it. "Actually, I want to kill you." The atmosphere, which had just seemed to have become more harmonious, immediately turned into the cold night of the Qin kingdom's northern border because of the eldest princess' cold words with a smile on her face. It froze everything in Guangxin Palace. The warm white gauze fluttering around them also drooped down weakly. Fan Xian maintained his gentle smile, but he moved his right foot back 2 inches, assuming the position where it was easiest to exert force. The Overwatch Council had long discovered the relationship between Wu Bowen and this woman. Since this woman had already tried to kill him twice, it would not be impossible for her to do it a third time in Guangxin Palace, which was filled with hidden murderous intent. Of course, everyone in the capital knew that he had entered the palace. Logically speaking, no one would be crazy enough to try to kill him in the palace. But after entering Guangxin Palace, seeing the eldest princess' childish demeanor and tone of voice, Fan Xian felt an inexplicable chill in his heart. This woman seemed to be crazy. He was now massaging the eldest princess' head. Although it was her request and he was going to marry her daughter, there was a difference between a man and a woman. What if this woman casually used the crime of flirting with the princess and incestuous to send people to kill him? What could the people behind him do? They would not be able to save him in time. Fan Xian knew that the truly terrifying things in this world were children, women, and crazy people. Because these three types of people could not be judged or analyzed rationally. At any time they could do something crazy with serious consequences. And in Fan Xian's eyes, this extremely beautiful young woman under his command was, without a doubt, a combination of these three poisons. She was a clear-minded and ruthless woman, but her actions were childish and her methods were crazy. She made up the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, who was different from the others and particularly terrifying. At this moment, a few serving girls walked into the palace. They wore light pomegranate-colored, tight-fitting serving girl robes that showed off their curves, but were very convenient to attack. Their belts were a bit thick, and Fan Xian, who had immersed himself in the art of assassination for 10 years in Danzhou, could immediately see that within those belts were extremely sharp swords. But his fingers continued to steadily rub the soft skin under the eldest princess' ear. With a face full of smiles, he said, "Princess, why do you want to kill me? Many people think I have a reason to kill you, and it is a very good reason." The eldest princess' eyes were still closed, as if she was not at all afraid that Fan Xian would suddenly counterattack and kill her under his fingers. Fan Xian lowered his head and did not reply. It was as if he was concentrating all of his attention on his fingers. Actually, his eyes were tightly closed up until now. Guangxin Palace was so quiet that even a ghost cat could be heard walking by. A few serving girls slowly moved closer to the eldest princess' side. Fan Xian's eyes were closed, but his head was slightly tilted to the right. "Master Fan, please clean your hands." Who knew where the serving girls came from, but the serving girls brought warm water and towels. Fan Xian opened his eyes and bowed to the eldest princess. He smiled and thanked the serving girls. He soaked his somewhat numb hands in the warm water and wiped them clean with a towel. He bowed all the way to the ground. "Does your highness feel better?" The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, looked at him with a smile that was not a smile. There was still a trace of timidity in her soft eyes, but Fan Xian knew that this woman was definitely one of the most terrifying people in the world. "Much better." The eldest princess slowly straightened her body and tidied her black hair. She lowered her head and said gently, "I did not think that the husband that Wan is about to marry would have such a good skill. To tell the truth, I am a little reluctant to part with you." Fan Xian stood respectfully and quietly at the lower end, not daring to say anything more. He knew that when faced with such a woman, no matter what he said, it would create a difficult result to analyze. Thus, he might as well play the trick of not saying 1,000 words as one. "You go. I'm a little tired." The eldest princess's lips bloomed like a flower. She said softly, "Tell Sister Lu that she did not come to see me today. I'm very disappointed." After Fan Xian respectfully left Guangxin Palace, the eldest princess' trusted serving girl walked to her side and quietly asked, "Princess, should we kill him?" "I was just playing with a child. Otherwise life in the palace would be really boring." The eldest princess stretched like a cat. She was very lazy and very seductive. "This young man is really beyond my expectations. He is like a person in his 30s or 40s. He is very tolerant and very good at hiding." The eldest princess did not have any intention of killing him at first. But seeing Fan Xian's every step of defense and not a single flaw, this wonderful woman who saw fighting as a game, gradually began to itch in her heart. Given her position in the palace and the perverted mentality that even Fan Xian could think of, if Fan Xian actually lost focus for a moment, she would probably give the order to kill him. Her gaze glanced at the palace door that was faintly visible through the layers of white gauze. A strange smile rose to the corners of her lips. She thought to herself, "In the instant you were about to attack, you slightly tilted your head. What did that mean? I'm truly curious. Fan Xian, how did you grow up? What a pity." He didn't know what this woman was feeling sorry for. Perhaps it was for the danger that Fan Xian would face in a few days. Fan Xian grew up playing with poisons, so he realized that the eldest princess was a rare and powerful poison. She was a difficult character for him to deal with. Leaving Guangxin Palace, he looked expressionlessly at the dozing palace maid Xing and said coldly, "Let's go back." He then walked toward Yi Guiping's palace. Surprisingly, he didn't go the wrong way. Only now did Xing realize that Master Fan's back was already wet with sweat. His light blue robe had a dark mark on it. He looked very wretched. Leaving the palace, Fan Xian boarded the carriage waiting at the far end of the square. His face was a little pale. His hand rested on his abdomen and pressed on the pill in his belt. He laughed at himself, not knowing whether he was a careful thinker or a coward. If the eldest princess really wanted to kill him, why would she choose Guangxin Palace? Are you all right? Fan Ruoruo looked at her brother sympathetically. She had no idea how tiring his conversation in Guangxin Palace had been. She thought he was just tired from going around visiting the empress. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. He relayed to Lady Lu the greetings that the empress had asked him to pass on. He then urged the carriage to hurry back to the manor. Lady Lu and Fan Ruoruo looked at him curiously. They didn't understand why he was in such a hurry. The carriage drove into a side alley next to Fan Manor. Fan Xian excused himself to Lady Lu, then took his sister's slightly cold hand and rushed to the back garden. After a short while they were in the study. Fan Ruoruo pressed on her heaving chest and said breathlessly, "Brother, what are you doing?" Chapter 132. Fan Xian didn't have time to explain. He smiled and ordered, "I'll talk, you remember?" He didn't have time to grind the ink. He picked up a quill, dipped it in some of the ink left in the inkstone and gave it to his sister. He then closed his eyes and began to recall the complicated layout of the palace courtyards and paths. The more Fan Ruoruo wrote, the paler her face became. Because Fan Xian was trying to memorize, his face also became paler. The two of them looked like two white faces. With great difficulty, Fan Ruoruo drew most of the paths in the palace. Finally, Fan Ruoruo couldn't help but cry out in a low voice, "Brother, don't you know that this is a great crime?" Fan Xian relaxed and sat down in a chair. He didn't speak for a long time. Today he had spent half a day in the palace. He had to chat with the nobles and remember the complicated roads. In the end, he had to have a mental battle with the eldest princess for a long time. It was too exhausting and he couldn't recover for a while. He was familiar with the laws of the Qing kingdom, and he knew that the palace buildings were not allowed to be drawn. This was to prevent people from sneaking into the palace to do treasonous things. Fan Xian needed this map because he had already made a plan. In this plan he would sneak into the palace that night to find the key. He could ask Lin Wan'er about the paths in the palace, but that was too risky. Furthermore, the paths taken by the masters of the palace were completely different from the paths Fan Xian had carefully planned. Even if Wu Zhu told him, it wouldn't work, like the hiding places behind the fake mountains, or the blind spots in the bushes of flowers. If he hadn't walked them himself, he wouldn't have been able to draw a map that satisfied him. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the table to pick up his sister's drawing. Although it was done in a hurry, his sister's brushwork was still meticulous. He couldn't help but happily pat her on the head. "It's done. I'll invite you to Yishir Tavern for some seafood." Fan Ruoruo was angry. She snatched the map back. "It's done? What's done? Do you know how big of a deal this is?" "No, I'm going to tell father." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He thought to himself that the concept of the inviolability of the emperor's power was indeed deeply ingrained in people's hearts. Of course, he also understood that his sister was mainly worried about his safety and the children of the manor. If others knew that he had secretly drawn a map of the royal palace, given the relationship between the Fan Manor and the royal family, it would probably be very tragic. "Don't worry, I'll rest in a bit. I'll immediately memorize this map and then burn it. No one will know." Fan Xian smiled and comforted his sister. Tears welled up in Fan Ruoruo's eyes. "Brother, why did you draw this picture?" Fan Xian sighed and lowered his head to look into his sister's eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, "Because there is something I want in the royal palace." "You want to go to the palace to steal?" Fan Ruoruo was so surprised that she wanted to scream, but she quickly covered her mouth. Fan Xian said seriously, "Correct, but I didn't steal it. That thing was mine to begin with." Fan Ruoruo shook off her shock and immediately recovered her usual calm and intelligence. She deduced the truth of the matter and lowered her trembling voice. "Does it have something to do with me?" Fan Xian smiled. "I can't hide this from you." It was a few simple words, but they were filled with the trust between brother and sister. He continued to smile. "It doesn't matter. What kind of person is your brother?" He punched a 7-year-old child and kicked an old man in his 70s. He stood on an unmarked grave and roared, "If you don't believe me, come out." But no one dared to make a sound. Ruoruo laughed with some difficulty. She didn't think her brother's joke was funny, but she was still worried. She knew that Fan Xian looked beautiful and gentle, but in reality, his heart was exceptionally hard and cold. She couldn't persuade him, so she could only let him be and pray at home every day. Actually, I'm very selfish. Fan Xian looked at the worry on her brow and suddenly calmed himself. Every time there's something I can't bear alone, I'm willing to tell you. It looks like I trust you, but in reality I just want to find someone to share the pressure with. But I never thought that this kind of pressure is actually a greater pain for you. At least I still have you to talk to. Who can you talk to? For example, my mother is the mistress of the Yi family, or I'm about to go to the palace to steal something. Ruoruo looked at him with a trace of worry. Trust and pressure cancel each other out. I still like that you don't hide things from me. The negotiations were still going on. The work of redrawing the border was very difficult. Originally, with the support of Fan Xian's analysis of the case, the official in charge of the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple of Qing was unusually tough. Several times he almost forced the Northern Qi envoys to sign their names on the documents. But for some reason, perhaps because something had happened in Northern Qi, the Northern Qi envoys shamelessly and even hysterically dragged on, as if they were waiting for something. This smell of conspiracy was immediately picked up by the experienced vice minister of the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple, Xan Chiwu. That afternoon, after a fruitless negotiation, he held a small teapot and looked at Fan Xian, indicating for him to follow him out. Along the way there were officials who paid their respects to the two envoys. With great difficulty they found a quiet place. Xan Chiwu sighed tiredly. Master Fan, do you feel that something is amiss? Regarding this negotiation, although Fan Xian had the correct attitude of observing and learning, he had participated from start to finish, and so he felt that the change in attitude of the Northern Qi envoys was a little strange. But if they had recently obtained a bargaining chip to rely on, it should have been laid out by now. There was no way they were still dragging on the negotiation table like a scoundrel. He thought for a moment and suddenly frowned. I'm afraid that Northern Qi is now thinking of a way to obtain a bargaining chip to use on the negotiation table. Xan Chiwu looked at him and nodded. I think so too. So tonight, I will enter the palace to see His Majesty and ask His Majesty to issue an edict ordering the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council to assist the Chamberlain of Honglu Temple. If I don't find out what Northern Qi is thinking, I won't be able to rest easy. Fan Xian leaned against the railing and narrowed his eyes and thought. What did Northern Qi want? Unreasonably, he thought of the Overwatch Council's spy network in Northern Qi, and of Yan Bingyun who had been hiding in Northern Qi for 4 years. Xan Chiwu didn't know what Fan Xian was thinking, but he said calmly, I will enter the palace tonight, but I won't be able to obtain much on the surface. Deputy Fan, you can no longer hide your abilities. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. Xan Chiwu must have thought that his father had secretly helped him obtain the dossier. But the heavens knew that his father had secretly helped the emperor manage a power that even he had never come into contact with. But after thinking about it, he felt that he really needed to ask. At the very least, he needed to ensure Yan Bingyun's safety in Northern Qi. That night, in the hidden courtyard, Fan Xian summoned Wang Qinian and told him about his and Xan Chiwu's concerns. Wang Qinian's reaction gave Fan Xian an ominous feeling. The council hasn't received a greeting from the crows for 8 days. Wang Qinian's brows were tightly furrowed. This kind of information shouldn't be available to someone of your level. Fan Xian smiled and shook his head. But I'm not going to ask you how you know. I just want you to remind the council to be careful in Northern Qi. Wang Qinian shook his head. It's all one-way communication. If it's broken, it'll be hard to get it back. Besides, Yan Bingyun is the head spy of Northern Qi. If something happens to him, there'll be no point in contacting him again. No matter what, we have to remind him to be careful. A cold light flashed in Fan Xian's eyes. He didn't like giving up on anyone for the sake of the country, especially Yan Bingyun. As the son of a high-ranking official, he had been undercover for 4 years and had sacrificed much. Fan Xian now saw himself as a part of the kingdom of Qing and the Overwatch Council. Naturally, he felt a kind of admiration for Yan Bingyun, whom he had never met. Fan Xian was thinking of something else. He looked at Wang Qinian calmly. I have a mission, but I can't go through the council. I hope I can ask for your help. Wang Qinian looked at Fan Xian, confused. You can't tell Director Qin. Fan Xian's tone was calm, but Wang Qinian could hear the coldness in it. Yes. As soon as he said this, Wang Qinian knew that he had bet his life on this seemingly gentle, but actually ruthless, young man. As for the council, Director Qin had only told him to listen to Fan Xian and nothing else. That night, the unfortunate news was finally confirmed. The spy network of the 4th Bureau of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council in northern Qi had fortunately been largely preserved. But to everyone's surprise, as the head of the spy network, Yan Bingyun, had been captured alive by northern Qi's internal experts in a silk shop in Shangjing. For such an incident, it was usually broken through from the lower levels, and then traced back to the top. It was rare for someone at the top of the spy network to be captured in one fell swoop. For such a situation to occur, there was only one possibility. Someone in the upper levels of the Kingdom of Qing had colluded with a foreign country. Of course, the news of Yan Bingyun's capture could not be spread. Although that would be a blow to the Kingdom of Qing's reputation, it would be even more detrimental to northern Qi's interests. Northern Qi needed such a leader in exchange for corresponding benefits, not just to strike at the enemy's morale. As for the Qing bureaucracy, the eldest son of Yan Ruohai, the head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, had died 4 years ago. No one knew that he had been sent to northern Qi by the royal court. In the past few days, no one who knew about this had been able to sleep well. In the most secret room of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, Vice Minister Xan closed his eyes and handed a piece of paper to Fan Xian. Fan Xian took it and looked at it. It was a painting of a thin cloud flying high above the icy plains. During the negotiations that day, an unremarkable figure in the Northern Qi diplomatic mission had secretly handed it to Vice Minister Xan. At the time, the expression on that person's face had almost provoked Vice Minister Xan to draw his guard sword and strike him. The two words Bingyun were hidden in the painting. It seemed that the Northern Qi diplomatic mission had received the news and were preparing to make an offer. Chapter 133. There really is a traitor. Fan Xian and Xan both opened their mouths at the same time, and then shut their mouths at the same time. Both of them believed that the head spy of Northern Qi was not a weakling who would speak under torture. Since he could so easily capture Yan Bingyun and learn his real name, it was clear that someone hidden in the Qing court had some sort of agreement with Northern Qi. Xan shook his head. Before this, even the Crown Prince and I did not know that Yan Bingyun had gone to Northern Qi. I think that there are no more than 5 people in the court who have the right to know about this. Even a fool would not believe that they had betrayed the country. There are always benefits to betraying the country, and in reality the entire Qing kingdom is run by His Majesty. What benefits could there be from betraying the country? Fan Xian and Xan looked at each other and saw the worry in each other's eyes. Both of them thought of a frightening possibility. What if it wasn't a traitor? What if it was a ploy by some official to attack the Overwatch Council? Fan Xian thought back to when Wang Qinian had told him about Yan Bingyun, and he had felt it was strange. How did he know? Was the Overwatch Council so confident in their own internal control? Only later did he realize that Qin Pingping had told him through Wang Qinian. But he still felt some lingering fear. If the news had leaked from his side, he would not be able to escape death. Could there be such a crazy person? For the sake of a power struggle in the court, they would trample on the interests of the entire Qing kingdom. Xan shook his head with a bitter smile. Fan Xian shook his head as well. Thinking of his trip to the palace, he knew that there were many such madmen in the kingdom of Qing. He composed himself and asked, assuming that Yan Bingyun has been captured, what will His Majesty do? Northern Qi underestimated His Majesty's determination. When Vice Minister Xan thought of the lofty Son of Heaven, he immediately felt emboldened and said, I will not yield even an inch of the territory that I have occupied. Fan Xian was surprised. What about Yan Bingyun? Exchange? Xan's expression was sinister. Exchange prisoners. His Majesty has made up his mind. The previous prisoner exchange agreement will be cancelled and a new one will be drafted. All we need to do is wait for Northern Qi to send Yan Bingyun's token for confirmation. After that, a new round of prisoner exchange negotiations will begin. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, Northern Qi thinks they're holding a big fish, so they probably won't agree. This time, we will send 2 more people back to Northern Qi, Vice-Chancellor Xan said coldly. If Northern Qi is still unwilling, in 3 months in the early winter the Emperor will behead Northern Qi, capture the heads of 1,000 people, send them back to Northern Qi and the army will rise again. Using power to suppress others can be considered a helpless move. I'm just afraid that Northern Qi will also fight to the death. There are 3,000 captives on both sides. No matter how much they kill, it will be useless. Fan Xian's hand lightly slapped the desk, and a strange thought suddenly welled up in his mind. Who are the 2 people preparing to join in the exchange of prisoners? Can Northern Qi agree? One is Xiao En, who has been locked up for 20 years. Xan Xiaoqing looked at him warmly, knowing that this young man did not know Xiaoen's name. This man was the head spy of Northern Wei. Before the second Northern Expedition, Director Qin of the Overwatch Council and Master Fei personally led the Black Knights and captured Xiaoen alive on the day of his son's wedding. After he was captured, the Northern Wei spy network was like a group of dragons without a leader, and became a pile of loose sand. When the Emperor personally led the expedition, he was able to break through like a hot knife through butter, and beat a huge empire into its current weak state. Later, when the merit was discussed, the Overwatch Council was awarded the highest merit. At the time, we young scholars all believed that if Xiaoen had not been so bold as to leave Shangjing of Northern Qi to attend his son's wedding, the imperial court would not have been able to capture him, and the subsequent battles would not have gone so smoothly. Hearing this story from decades ago, Fan Xian sighed and was speechless. He listened to Xn Xiaoqing's last words. Of course, Xiaoen was bold enough to leave Shangjing. Director Qin was even bolder, daring to enter 800 li into enemy territory. Although he paid the price of a pair of legs, he still managed to capture Xiaoen. Before that, Xiaoen of Northern Wei and Qin Pingping of Southern Qing were known to the world as the most fearsome dark ministers. After Xiaoen was captured alive by Director Qin, naturally no one dared to compare him to him. Fan Xian listened with yearning. So that was how the old cripple's legs were broken. He had never imagined that Qin Pingping had such a heroic side to him. Exchanging Xiaoen for Yan Bingyun. He thought for a moment, then judged purely from reason. It seems we are at a disadvantage. Last night, several ministers thought so too. Xn Xiaoqing looked at him with a smile. But the Emperor and Director Qin did not think so. After all, Xiaoen is already 70 years old, and once he was defeated by Director Qin, he naturally could not regain his former glory. Master Yan endured humiliation and hid in enemy territory for 4 years, and his contributions were self-evident. Exchanging an old man for the future of the kingdom of Qin, what is wrong with that? Fan Xian nodded and asked curiously, were you afraid that Northern Qi would not agree? Who else did they add? That woman was a request of Northern Qi in the past, so His Majesty simply agreed. Xn Xiaoqing looked at Fan Xian and suddenly laughed. I heard that the Emperor of Northern Qi was very fond of that woman. It seems that in the future, Master Fan, you have already made the young Emperor of Northern Qi a cuckold. Fan Xian's expression was a little strange. Could it be Sea Lily? The negotiations were always divided into 2 parts. On the surface, the ministers of the Kingdom of Qing and the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi deliberated over every word at the negotiating table. Every title and every word displayed a certain kind of morbid stubbornness. Only in this way could the face of the Kingdom of Qing be preserved, and not be weakened in the final letter of credence. So every day Honglu Temple was always noisy, with people banging on tables and trampling on chairs. It did not seem like 2 countries were negotiating, but more like shrews in a wet market cursing each other. The other part of the negotiations was much colder and more direct. There were no officials from the Chamberlain of Dependencies present, and Northern Qi was not the leader of the diplomatic mission. Instead, they were hidden in the dark and had the power to speak. Yan Ruahai, the head of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, was a well-known figure in the upper echelons of the capital, where officials were like roaming carp. He coldly signed the secret agreement for the exchange of prisoners and did not look at the document again. On the agreement was the name of his own son. He could have resigned from the negotiations, but he had insisted on coming to take a look. The unremarkable official from Northern Qi smiled and signed. He looked at Yan Ruahai and said quietly, "Do not worry, Master Yan. Your son is doing very well in this country." Yan Ruahai said expressionlessly, "Today I wanted to see how clever my colleagues in the north were to be able to capture the little brat that I raised. But when I saw you, an idiot, I knew what was going on." The official did not fly into a rage. He only coldly retorted, "Master Yan, do not be too harsh with your words. You must know that your son is still in our hands. If we are idiots, then what is your son? And what are you?" Yan Ruahai laughed coldly. He got up and walked out the door. "The problem is, my son was not captured by you." Outside the door, Qin Pingping looked at him from his wheelchair and shook his head. "You have been in this position for too long. You are no longer as tolerant as you were." "I can tolerate many things, but I cannot tolerate arrows shot from the back." It was clear that Yan Ruahai respected his superior very much. He slowly pushed Qin Pingping's wheelchair and walked to a quiet place. Qin Pingping sat in his wheelchair and raised a finger. "In the court, who knows how many people want to die for you and me? This time we can trade Xiaoen for Bingyun. Next time I will not have someone like Xiaoen in my hands." Yen Ruahai replied, "There will not be a next time. We must hurry and find that person," Qin Pingping said. Qin Pingping said, "This time His Majesty is standing on our side, because he clearly knows that some noble person wants to teach us a lesson. But I do not like the feeling of being provoked." "Yes, Director." Yen Ruahai knew that his old superior would think of a way to deal with this matter, so he was not in a hurry. Although the prisoner exchange may not go smoothly, as long as Bingyun does not die, it will be a trial for the young. It is not necessarily a bad thing. That makes sense. So I have decided to let a young man go and temper himself. It won't take too long, just a few months. A few months? Is it about the diplomatic mission to Northern Qi? Correct. And we must bring Yen Bingyun back in one piece. I hope he can handle it well. Who is it? Before I leave, I will let the 8 bureaus meet with him. Everything proceeded smoothly. After the kingdom of Qing paid a considerable price, the two sides came to an agreement on the exchange of prisoners and spies. Everyone was happy. The kingdom of Qing gained face and territory. Northern Qi gained face, Shaoan and the woman the emperor liked. Only the envoy from Dongyi remained in the courtyard. Everyone seemed to have forgotten about him. The kingdom of Qing was deliberately giving the other side the cold shoulder, using the incident at the foot of the Tsang Mountains to extort more money. Dongyi was the gathering place of the world's largest merchants. Long before the kingdom of Qing opened the southern ports, they had begun trading with foreigners. Although they only had Sigujian and martial arts, their financial resources were inexhaustible. 3 days later, the emperor of Qing would hold a banquet for the two countries' envoys. As the deputy envoy, Fan Xian naturally had to attend the banquet in the palace. It would be his second time entering the palace, and it would also be the night he had planned. He carefully prepared everything in his room, but occasionally his eyes would glance at the black leather suitcase peeking out from under his bed. In the past few days of official business, he had seen something more deeply. The kingdom of Qing appeared to be powerful and insufferably arrogant, but because of the unspeakable thoughts of certain nobles in the court, there was still so much filth and darkness. The royal family was ruthless, but not necessarily to the members of the royal family. More to the subjects of the world. Fan Xian knew very well that even if the emperor knew who wanted to deal with his own secret service, he would not actually kill them because those people could be his wife, his sister, his son, or even his mother. Be a person who thinks only for yourself. This was something Fan Xian had reminded himself countless times since coming to this world. His eyes gradually grew cold. He hid the slender dagger and carefully inserted the 3 poison-soaked needles into his hair. Chapter 134. 3 days later, ceremonial music was played. Red lanterns were hung high, and an endless stream of guests came and went. It was a splendid scene of prosperity. The Northern Qi diplomatic mission and the Dongyi guests were welcomed by the kingdom of Qing. Their faces were full of smiles as they walked along the long passageway into the most solemn palace of the kingdom of Qing. Looking at the expressions of the 3 parties, it seemed that the world was at peace, and that the battles and assassinations of the past few days had never happened. The location of the banquet was Qinian Hall in the outer city of the palace. The palace maids who carried food and wine to and fro in front of the table were very beautiful. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and smiled as he watched them bustle about in the grand palace. The palace maids noticed that the young and handsome Fan Xian was looking at them in a different light, and they couldn't help but feel a little shy. Their faint blush grew even redder, and they stole glances at him from time to time. The distinguished guests gathered in front of the hall, but not a single sound could be heard. Many of the kingdom of Qing's guests were ministers and nobles that Fan Xian had never seen before. Only Director Qin and the Prime Minister were absent due to illness. Across from him sat the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi and the diplomatic mission of Dongyi. Although Fan Xian's position was low, he was also a deputy, so he was arranged to sit in the middle of the table. Beside him were some senior officials, and he couldn't help but feel a little uncomfortable. At that moment, he heard an old man next to him say with a smile, "There are many rules at the banquet, but His Majesty has always been easygoing. Don't be nervous, Master Fan." This old man was Zhang Ziqian, an assistant minister of the Board of Rights. Because Fan Xian had an unresolvable grudge against the Guo family of the Board of Rights, he was secretly wary of this man. But hearing his words, he didn't seem to have any ill intentions. Fan Xian couldn't help but smile shamefully. "I've lived in the countryside all my life. I've never seen such a grand occasion. If I've been disrespectful in any way, I hope you can point me out." Zhang Ziqian stroked his long beard and smiled. Rin Shaoqing said in court today that Master Fan had contributed greatly to this negotiation. At this time, no one in court will do anything to you. Just be careful of those people across from you. The two of them looked across and saw Chang Ningho of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission waiting, bored out of his mind. The table in front of them was still empty. Presumably, it was occupied by the elusive Zhuang Mohan. At the head of the Dongyi envoys sat a middle-aged man with a sword strapped to his waist. Fan Xian couldn't help but frown. How could he enter the palace with a sword? His Majesty has personally approved it. The disciples of Sigu Sword School never leave their swords. This is a special case, Zhang Ziqian explained in detail as if he were explaining to a junior. He is Sigu Sword's first disciple, Yun Jilan? Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and narrowed his eyes. Immediately, he felt a murderous intent naturally emanating from the sword-bearing man. These days, the Qing court had deliberately given the Dongyi envoys the cold shoulder. It seemed that this ninth-level swordsman Yun Jilan was not in a good mood. Even sitting in the palace of the Qing kingdom, his entire person was still cold. Fan Xian was looking at Yun Jilan's sword-like brows. Coincidentally, Yun Jilan was also looking at him. Their gazes met like lightning in the air of the palace. A moment later, Fan Xian lowered his head in a show of weakness and gently coughed. The sword intent in his opponent's gaze was too strong. This exchange of glances immediately drew the attention of everyone in the hall. Everyone knew that Fan Xian had killed 2 female disciples of Sigu Sword School on Yolan Street, and that Dongyi had come to pay tribute to clean up the aftermath of that incident. But according to most people's opinions, this swordsman Yun Jilan would not mind killing Fan Xian with his sword. Fortunately, the Crown Prince of the Eastern Palace had expressed some goodwill towards Fan Xian through negotiations over personnel arrangements. Thus, no one in the court, regardless of which faction, dared to take pleasure in Fan Xian's misfortune because of this. With a foreign enemy in front of them, all the officials of the Qing kingdom, as well as those in the military, glared fiercely at Yun Jilan. The atmosphere in the entire palace suddenly became tense. Fan Xian's face was expressionless. He lowered his head and adjusted the jinqi in his body, ready at any moment. At this moment, the faint sound of a zither came from the side of the palace. Amidst the solemn palace music, a eunuch loudly shouted, "His Majesty has arrived." The most powerful man in the world, the only master of the Qing kingdom, the emperor, accompanied by the empress, slowly approached from the side. With a warm smile on his face, he stood in front of the dragon throne. Long live the emperor! Long live the emperor! The officials in front of the hall knelt down respectfully and the guests of the diplomatic mission bowed. The remaining tension in the hall was replaced by an inexplicable sense of solemnity and respect. The emperor sat high above, accompanied by the empress. The crown prince also had a unique seat 2 steps below his parents. Normally, the other princes would not come to such an occasion. The emperor's gaze swept across the officials below. "You may rise," he said warmly. He bowed and rose, and the feast officially began. First, the officials of the Northern Qi diplomatic mission stepped forward. They sang their praises as usual, proclaiming the traditional friendship between the 2 countries, and then retreated. Yun Jilan of Dongyi stepped forward, expressionlessly said a few words, and then also retreated. The empress smiled and whispered in His Majesty's ear, "This man from Dongyi is quite arrogant." The emperor and empress sat high above. Their conversation could not be overheard, so they spoke directly. His Majesty also smiled warmly. If the first disciple of Sigu Sword did not have the slightest bit of arrogance, I'm afraid he would not even have the courage to hold a sword in my room. The palace maids had long since replaced the hot dishes. The officials buried their heads in their food, not daring to speak. Since His Majesty did not speak, it was naturally quiet. Fan Xian lowered his head in discomfort, but his eyes were undetectable as he glanced at the seat opposite him. The previously empty seat was now occupied by a man. His face was old, but his eyes were clear and spirited. The wrinkles on his forehead seemed to contain a great deal of wisdom. His white robes wrapped around his not-so-tall body like a cloud. Without asking, he knew that this was Zhuang Mohan of Northern Qi. Fan Xian did not know when he had sat down, but he guessed that he had entered at the same time as the emperor. It seemed that the rumors were true. This Zhuang Mohan was greatly appreciated by the Empress Dowager. Perhaps he had been in the palace all this time. When Fan Xian stole a glance at the man, he did not know that the high and mighty couple were also looking at him. The Empress took a sip of wine and indicated where Fan Xian was sitting with her eyes. "That young man is Fan Xian, Princess Chen's future son-in-law," she said quietly. His Majesty smiled. He looks handsome and he has some fame in the capital. At court today, Xan Chiwu and Rin Xiao, and the two vice ministers, both praised his talent. I am truly curious as to why the crown prince's servant and the prime minister's student are so friendly to him. The empress's smile was a bit forced. Perhaps the crown prince understands the importance of popularity? Besides, he is soon to be the prime minister's son-in-law. Oh, popularity? His Majesty smiled faintly. He did not look at the empress. Instead he looked at his son. It seems that my son also understands the importance of popularity. Although she could hear a trace of dissatisfaction in his voice, the empress still felt that his Majesty was in a good mood today. He was not only willing to berate the crown prince, but also had some positive comments. She could not help but say happily, Chengchen is growing up. He will understand some things. His Majesty smiled wordlessly. After a while, Fan Xian kept drinking, perhaps because he was nervous or for some other reason. This wine was at most a type of millet wine. It was not very strong and tasted sweet and sour. Fan Xian did not think much of it, but in the eyes of the officials next to him, the way this young man drank was like that of a fierce animal. Even the assistant minister of the Ministry of Rights, Zhang Ziqian, could not help but remind him, Sir Fan, don't drink too much. If you make a faux pas in front of His Majesty, that would be a great crime. Hearing the words Sir Fan, he knew that Zhang Ziqian was reminding him that this was not Lujing River, but deep in the palace. He was not a guest but an official. Fan Xian smiled inwardly, but his jinchi reversed, forcing the drunkenness onto his face. His eyes suddenly became a bit hazy. He lowered his voice and said, I dare not hide it from you, sir. I'm really nervous. Why don't I quickly drink some wine and relax a bit? Zhang Ziqian looked at Fan Xian's drunken state, as if he could not hear him clearly. He could only shake his head and smile bitterly. The Prime Minister claimed to be ill and did not come, and your father did not come either. Instead he left you in my care. If you really get drunk, how am I supposed to explain it to them? These days, the diplomatic mission of Northern Qi had been put in a difficult position by the diplomatic officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. Seeing Fan Xian's state, they could not help but look at each other and make up their minds. These days, although Fan Xian was the deputy, he had been silent. But the diplomatic mission deeply disliked the mischievous look on his beautiful face. Northern Qi still had many spies in the capital of the Kingdom of Qin. Of course, they knew that the reason the Chamberlain of Dependencies was so powerful this time was all because of the bad ideas of the deputy Fan Xian. As for what those bad ideas were, no one knew. Now that the negotiations between the two countries had been completed, and the royal families of both sides had signed their names, there was no way to go back on their word. But the Northern Qi diplomatic mission still had a big knot in their hearts. Seeing Fan Xian's drunken state, Chang Ningho smiled sinisterly. He stood up and respectfully bowed to the high ground. Your Majesty, these days the negotiations between the two sides have been tiring. The people of the Chamberlain of Dependencies have also been tiring. I wonder if I could offer a toast to the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies, to show the friendship between our two countries? When Chang Ningho spoke, the diplomatic mission of Dongyi sat next to them. Naturally, they saw Fan Xian's drunken state and knew what the Northern Qi people wanted to do. They only looked on coldly, not joining in the fun. The dragon chair was too high, and the Emperor and the Empress did not seem to see the undercurrent of the situation. Naturally, they did not notice Fan Xian and laughed. The Crown Prince also joined in the fun. Chang Ningho naturally wants to enjoy himself to the fullest. Opponents on the battlefield, friends off the battlefield? And of course at the wine table we are only opponents. The Crown Prince actually just wanted to show off his conversational skills, but they were quite ordinary and he did not know how things would develop. This worried the officials of the Chamberlain of Dependencies. In these days of negotiations, everyone had long since regarded Deputy Fan as one of their own. How could they let the Northern Qi people get Deputy Fan drunk? But the two sides were sitting far apart and there was no way to help. Fan Xian smiled and drank with the Northern Qi diplomatic mission, but he felt a faint sense of unease. In recent days, the merchants under the control of the eldest princess had begun to act against Danbo bookstore, raising the price of paper and lowering the price of books. These two simple moves were enough to make Fan Xizha and the 7th Yi shopkeeper very depressed. But Fan Xian knew that the real tricks were still to come. And what he was going to do today required the help of wine. It was difficult not to get drunk, but it was even more difficult to pretend to be drunk. This was the strongest feeling Fan Xian had during his first court banquet. Northern Qi could not hold on any longer. 6 of the 8 ambassadors had fallen, and in the end even Chang Ningho no longer cared about his status and bravely sacrificed himself, half hanging from Fan Xian's arm. Up until now the emperor, who had been quietly talking with the empress and Zhuang Mohan, smiled. The palace has not been this lively in a long time. Zhuang Mohan had been silent the entire time, and only occasionally would the emperor ask him a few questions in a quiet voice. He had the air of a famous scholar. Following the emperor's gaze, he seemed to have just noticed the commotion. Looking at the beautiful young man holding Chang Ningho and pouring wine down his throat, he asked curiously, "That young man is Master Fan of the House of Poets?" This world-famous literary master seemed to find it hard to believe his own eyes. The legendary young scholar who won the fame of poetry with just 3 poems turned out to be a drunkard. The emperor seemed to be slightly annoyed and raised his voice. "Fan Xian." Everyone in the palace was paying close attention to the movements on the throne, for fear of a moment of carelessness. Therefore when the emperor spoke the entire palace quieted down. Not a single sound could be heard except for the young man called Fan Xian who was still shouting, "Victory! Victory!" That seemed to be a southern saying. It seemed that young Master Fan really had drunk too much. Fan Xian. Seeing that the young man was drunk, the crown prince could not help but rebuke him, suppressing his anger. After all, it was the Eastern Palace who had suggested Fan Xian as a deputy, and it was because of this that Fan Xian had the right to enter the palace that day. Fan Xian had lost face, and in the crown prince's heart, the crown prince felt that he had lost face. As if sensing the strange silence in the palace, Fan Xian stood where he was in a daze. His eyes swept around in a daze, but his beautiful face showed the freedom of drunkenness. "Who's calling me?" All the officials in the court who were on good terms with the Fan family and the Prime Minister wanted nothing more than to gag his mouth, shove him into a carriage and throw him back to Fan Manor. To everyone's surprise, the high and mighty emperor did not seem angry after hearing this response, which could only be heard in a restaurant. Instead he laughed. "I'm calling you." Hearing the word "I" woke up people regardless of whether they were really drunk or pretending to be drunk. Fan Xian was no exception. He loosened his grip and hurriedly bowed. I deserve to die. I drank too much." As he loosened his grip, Chang Ningho of Northern Qi, who had been choked by him, went limp and fell to the ground with a thud. The Qing official, seeing the enemy's chief negotiator in such a sorry state, smiled with satisfaction. The only 2 Northern Qi ambassadors who were not drunk hurriedly helped Chang Ningho back to his seat. A palace maid considerately brought him some soup to sober him up. The emperor reprimanded him. "Of course I know you drank too much. Otherwise I would have punished you for your lack of etiquette." Fan Xian struggled to maintain his bowed posture. He smiled bitterly and defended himself. "I dare not defend myself, but it is a pleasure to have guests from afar. If I do not properly entertain these important people from Northern Qi, as the deputy envoy, I cannot help but fail in my duty." His Majesty turned to the Empress. He still dares not defend himself. If he did, I'm afraid he would say that I made him drink and that he had nothing to do with it. The Empress knew that His Majesty had always loved Princess Chen. She didn't know if he loved her because of her. She smiled. Since she didn't speak up for Fan Xian, she wasn't stupid enough to rebuke him. Fan Xian. This was the 3rd time His Majesty had called out his name in the palace. The officials listened attentively, but in their hearts they felt something else. It seemed that the relationship between the Fan family and the royal family was not ordinary. His Majesty spoke lightly. "The relationship between the Fan family and me is not ordinary. In my eyes you are only a junior. Regardless of whether we are monarch or official, when I speak, you should keep your sharp tongue shut. Don't think I don't know what you said in the restaurant. At such a young age, do you really think you can look down on the people of this world just because you have a sharp tongue?" His Majesty was clearly denouncing him, but he was secretly protecting him. The officials and emissaries were not fools. They understood. As expected, His Majesty spoke quietly. On this late summer night, the monarch and his officials are in harmony, and the friendship between the 2 nations is strong. Fan Xian, you have always been famous for your poetry. Why don't you compose a poem? The officials all agreed, knowing that His Majesty was giving face to the Fan family. It seemed that His Majesty had a stroke of inspiration. He wanted to use today's banquet as an opportunity to let the officials know what kind of person this 8th-rank functionary of the Fan family was. His Majesty wanted to give Fan Xian a great opportunity to make a name for himself, but Fan Xian was half drunk. He was afraid that he would waste this opportunity. Was a pity. Fan Xian was indeed a little tipsy, but he had clearly heard the conversation in front of the palace. He laughed at himself and bowed in the direction of the dragon throne. "Your Majesty, I only know how to make a fool of myself in front of the great Zhuang Mohan." As soon as he said this, the officials all looked at Zhuang Mohan. Only now did they understand what His Majesty meant. He was not just giving Fan Xian a chance to make a name for himself. He wanted to use this opportunity to prove to the people of this world that in terms of martial arts, the kingdom of Qing was unparalleled. In terms of writing, the kingdom of Qing also had a talent that could rival Zhuang Mohan. Fan Xian's name, 10,000 miles sorrowful in autumn, always a guest, had been ringing in the capital for months. It was only after he had insisted on not composing poetry that the name gradually faded. Hearing him push the blame to Zhuang Mohan, the officials thought that he and His Majesty had long since secretly planned to strike a blow at the arrogance of the literary world of Northern Qi. In reality, Fan Xian was only guessing. His experience from his previous life was not enough for him to guess the emperor's heart. But seeing the flourishing style of writing in the kingdom of Qing, it seemed that His Majesty was not satisfied that he was undefeatable on the battlefield, and that he had always been viewed as a southern barbarian by the people of Northern Qi. After Zhuang Mohan came to the kingdom, he entered and left the palace. Although the Empress Dowager and the other ladies respected him for his literary reputation, His Majesty would probably feel very uncomfortable. Unfortunately, the kingdom of Qing had no literary masters, and so Fan Xian, a plagiarist, had been innocently pushed onto the stage. Fan Xian knew he had not guessed the emperor's meaning incorrectly. Even from a distance, his powerful eyesight could still see clearly that the emperor's eyes gradually narrowed. There was a glimmer of admiration in the depth of his gaze. This admiration, of course, was for Sir Fan Jr.'s understanding of the emperor's heart. At the same time, it was a warning to compose a good poem and not lose face for the kingdom of Qing in front of Zhuang Mohan. "Why don't you compose a poem and let Mr. Zhuang Mohan evaluate it? If it's not good, you will be punished by drinking wine." The Empress smiled. She knew what the man beside her was thinking, so she made preparations in advance. Now that things had come to this, what else could they do? Fan Xian returned to the table. Not caring that he was already drunk, he poured another cup and savored the slightly sour wine in his mouth. His brows were tightly furrowed. All the officials knew that Master Fan was eager for talent, so they secretly counted on his behalf. When he counted to about 15, a clear light appeared in Fan Xian's eyes. His face was full of smiles. His lips parted slightly as he recited, "Drinking and singing, how long is life? Take the morning dew for example, the bitter days that go by. Indigo collar, leisurely in my heart. But for the sake of the monarch, I have been groaning to this day. I have guessed to play the flute and the flute. Clearly like the moon, when will it disappear? At the banquet, the heart remembers old favors. The moon is bright and the stars are sparse, the crows fly south, circling the tree 3 times, where can they rest? The mountains are not too high, the sea is not too deep. The Duke of Zhou spits out, the world returns to its heart." Just like every time Fan Xian threw out a poem to beat people, this poem made the entire hall quiet. This was the masterpiece of Grandmaster Chao. Fan Xian had deleted a few lines and tossed it out. In this hall, the world returns to its heart, just in line with the emperor's thoughts. The most amazing thing was that the Duke of Zhou spits out actually existed in this world. Furthermore, this Duke of Zhou was not a follower of the emperor, but an actual emperor. That was why Fan Xian dared to write it out so grandly. After a long time in the Grand Palace, all the officials cheered in unison, "Good poem." The emperor showed a satisfied expression and turned to look at Zhuang Mohan. "What does Master Zhuang think of this poem?" he asked quietly. Zhuang Mohan's expression did not change. He did not know how many times he had experienced such a scene in his life, nor how many poems he had appraised. The reason he was respected by all the people, even the emperor and other officials of the kingdom of Qing, had read his essays and entered officialdom was because of his virtue and insight. Of course, the most important thing was his vast knowledge. "Good poem," Zhuang Mohan said quietly. He picked up a peanut with his chopsticks and ate it. "It is indeed a good poem. Although the meaning is broken, it wins in its quality. For poetry, the meaning comes first and quality is the most important. Master Fan's poem is full of quality, and it is indeed a good poem. Who would have thought that the kingdom of Qing could produce such a talent?" Fan Xian smiled slightly. He did not have any special feelings for this master of the literary world, but he did not like his style. After a slight bow, he returned to his seat, but his steps were a little shaky. The officials in the court were still whispering about Sir Fan Jr.'s earlier poem. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the end of the matter, but the atmosphere in the hall seemed a little strange today. One person said coldly, "What Master Zhuang said earlier about the kingdom of Qing was inappropriate. Everyone knows that you are a master of writing. But in terms of poetry you are not necessarily as good as Master Fan, so there is no need to make presumptuous comments. There are many scholars in this court and Master Fan is one of the best. Not to mention that he wrote a poem in 15 minutes, just the poem, 10,000 Li of Sorrowful Autumn is always a guest is enough. I truly do not know in the kingdom of Northern Qi, which scholar could write such a poem." These words were very inappropriate, especially at a national banquet. It was abnormally rude. The Emperor of Qing had not expected a common literary matter to reach this stage. The Emperor's brows gradually furrowed. He did not know which official had been so rude, but this person was, after all, feeling injustice for the court, and there was no way to punish him. Fan Xian stopped on his way back to the banquet, and bowed apologetically to Zhuang Mohan to show that he had not intended to be disrespectful. Zhuang Mohan coughed twice, and with some difficulty, stood up with the help of a young eunuch whom the Empress Dowager had pointed out to him. He looked calmly at Fan Xian. "Master Fan's poetry has long spread to Shangjing of the kingdom of Qi. I have often recited that 10,000 Li of Sorrowful Autumn is always a guest." Fan Xian suddenly saw a trace of pity in the eyes of this master of literature, a trace of decisiveness that cut off all avenues of retreat. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He felt some danger that he had not been aware of, slowly approaching him. He was getting tipsy, but he still turned his head abruptly, and behind the banquet table, he found the face that had started the fight. Guo Baoquan. Guo Baoquan, who had been punched by Fan Xian. Guo Baoquan, the crown prince's close aide. Guo Baoquan was also qualified to sit at the banquet table today. But it was clear that the crown prince had not known about this beforehand. So the crown prince and Fan Xian both narrowed their eyes, looking at Guo Baoquan's faintly smug face, unsure of what he wanted to do. Fan Xian felt the danger and smiled slightly. At that moment he heard Zhuang Mohan cough twice, and after bowing to the emperor he said quietly, "I am of the kingdom of Qi, but my heart is in the literature of the world. I do not wish to harm the friendship between the two countries, but there are some things that must be said." His Majesty's expression gradually calmed and he calmly said, "Master Zhuang, please speak." As His Majesty spoke, the Empress also raised her wine cup, opened her mouth to speak and then pulled it back. "The wind is urgent, the ape howls in sorrow, the white bird flies back on the clear sand. Boundless falling trees rustle down, the endless great river rolls in. 10,000 Li of Sorrowful Autumn is always a guest, 100 years of illness alone on the stage. Hardship and bitterness hate the thick frost on the temples, the destitute new wine cup stops." The palace was incomparably quiet. No one knew what this master of literature, whose name had shaken the world, would say. The first 4 lines of this poem are excellent. Chapter 135. Hearing the last line, the officials were puzzled. This poem had appeared in the capital in the spring, and had long since spread throughout the land. Aside from the words, "Great River," which were somewhat uncomfortable to read, many poets had always thought that there was nothing to nitpick about the poem. But the essence of the poem was in the last 4 lines, and they did not know why Zhuang Mohan had said so. Zhuang Mohan said coldly, "The reason why I say the first 4 lines are good is not because the last 4 lines are bad, but because the last 4 lines were not written by Master Fan." As soon as these words were said, there was an uproar in the hall, and then a deathly silence. No one spoke. Fan Xian pretended to be surprised, but he understood many things. He calmed down and his drunken body leaned against the table, smiling at Zhuang Mohan. A few months ago Lin Wanner had said that someone in the palace said that his poem was copied. At the time he did not care, but he did not expect it to explode today. Guo Baoquan had clearly been instructed by some noble to stir up this matter. After he entered the capital, the only thing he could use was his so-called literary reputation. If she completely destroyed his reputation, in a world where literature and virtue were highly valued, he would have no choice but to break off the engagement. After hearing Zhuang Mohan recite the first 4 lines, Fan Xian felt much more at ease. Seeing that Master Zhuang still did not know that the great river was the Yangtze, he knew that what he feared most had not happened. If he wanted to accuse Fan Xian of plagiarism, Zhuang Mohan could only rely on his own knowledge and reputation to suppress others. But he did not know how the eldest princess had persuaded Zhuang Mohan, who had always had a good reputation, to come all the way here to be a villain? After a long time. His Majesty frowned. Plagiarism was a serious accusation. If Zhuang Mohan did not have something to rely on, he would not have dared to make such irresponsible remarks in the palace of the Kingdom of Qin. Words are no proof. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Rites, Zhang Ziqian, who had been sitting next to Fan Xian, smiled. Master Zhuang Mohan is a master of his generation. When his students were young, they often studied the scriptures he had written. Naturally, no one in the world would dare to doubt his words. But in this case of plagiarism, perhaps he was deceived by a villain. He glanced at his superior's son, Guo Baoquan, and did not reveal who he was referring to. Zhuang Mohan raised his head. His eyes, which were full of wisdom, were filled with a complicated emotion. The last 4 lines of this poem were written by my master when he was traveling in Tingzhou. Because it was written by my master, I have kept it in my heart for decades. I don't know how Master Fan managed to come across these lines. Originally, I felt that it was good that the dust-burying pearl could see the light of day again. It's just that Master Fan is using this as an excuse to ask for my name, but I won't take it. A scholar's first priority is to cultivate his heart and virtue. I value talent as much as my life, and I do not wish to rashly expose this matter. My original intention was to come to the Kingdom of Qing and see what kind of person you are. Who would have thought that Master Fan would not repent? Instead, he has surpassed me. Fan Xian almost laughed in spite of himself. Shameless, he thought. But no one else could laugh. The atmosphere in front of the palace had long become oppressive. If this was true, not only would Fan Xian never have the face to enter the officialdom and literary circles, but the entire Qing court would lose all face. All the scholars in the world respected Zhuang Mohan's moral conduct and writings, and could not bring themselves to doubt him. Furthermore, Zhuang Mohan had said that it was written by his master. Given the hearts of the scholars in the world, this was tantamount to using his master's character as proof. Who would dare to doubt him? Deep in their hearts, the officials had already determined that Fan Xian's poem had been copied. They looked at him with strange disgust, but they could not let this matter become the truth. After all, this involved the face of the Kingdom of Qing. So His Majesty looked coldly at Grand Scholar Xu Wu of the Imperial Library. After a moment of awkwardness, Grand Scholar Xu stood up awkwardly and bowed to Zhuang Mohan. Greetings, Master. Grand Scholar Xu had traveled to northern Qi and received instruction from Zhuang Mohan, so they greeted him with the courtesy of a teacher and student. He had long since believed Zhuang Mohan's claim that Fan Xian's poem had been copied. But under His Majesty's stern gaze, he had no choice but to stand up and speak on Fan Xian's behalf. Master Fan has always been talented in poetry. Even this short song was excellent. It is hard to believe that he plagiarized it, and it does not seem necessary. Zhuang Mohan had already sat down. He coughed twice and warmly said, Xu Wu, could it be that you suspect I am stealing the name of my master? Grand Scholar Xu was sweating profusely and repeatedly said he did not dare. He no longer cared about His Majesty's cold gaze and obediently retreated. At this moment, if anyone still doubted him, it would be tantamount to saying that Zhuang Mohan was a shameless man who had no master or father. No one would dare bear this reputation. But His Majesty was no ordinary scholar. He was not Imperial Consort Xu, nor was he the Empress Dowager. He did not like Zhuang Mohan at all, so he coldly said, The Kingdom of Qing values the law. It is somewhat different from the weak state of northern Qi. If Master Zhuang wishes to accuse someone of a crime, then you must have some proof. All the officials could hear that His Majesty was angry. If Zhuang Mohan really did accuse Fan Xian of plagiarism, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to ever see the light of day again. Zhuang Mohan smiled slightly and had his attendant bring out a piece of paper. This is my master's handwriting. If anyone from the Fang family were to look at it, they would naturally know the date. He looked at Fan Xian and said sympathetically, Master Fan is talented in poetry, but he is too preoccupied with drawing tigers. He does not know that poetry is the heart of the heart. How could the last 4 words of this poem, given Master Fan's experiences? Inside the hall, only Zhuang Mohan's slightly aged but incomparably steady voice could be heard interpreting the poem. 10,000 li of sorrow for autumn, how cold it is. 100 years of sickness. It was when my master, in his twilight years, ascended the heights alone. The torrential river filled the eyes with desolation. Master Fan, you are still young. How do you explain this 100 years of sickness? The more Zhuang Mohan spoke, the more everyone felt that such a poem could not have been written by a young man. Then they heard Zhuang Mohan's voice once again. Frost on the temples is a cluster of white hair. Master Fan with a head of black hair is a bit too forceful to describe. Finally Zhuang Mohan said softly, as for the last line, dejected, I stopped drinking from my mug. Let's not talk about Master Fan's glorious family background and how dejected he is, but I'm afraid Master Fan does not understand why my master said these words. He looked at Fan Xian, and there seemed to be some pity between his brows. My master contracted a lung disease in his later years so he could not drink, so he used the words dejected. Hearing this, the officials of the kingdom of Qing finally lost their breath. There was no need for that piece of paper. With these unexplainable problems, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to escape the charge of plagiarism. Suddenly, there was a burst of applause in the quiet palace hall. Fan Xian, who had been leaning over the table in a drunken stupor, suddenly stood up and smiled at Zhuang Mohan. He slowly lowered his hand and in his heart he felt a bit of admiration. Naturally, no one knew who this Zhuang Mohan's master was, but for him to be able to deduce the circumstances of Du Fu's life and his illness from this poem, he was truly worthy of the title of the greatest master of literature in the world. But Fan Xian knew that Zhuang Mohan was trying to frame him, and that the piece of paper had probably already been dealt with, so he could not admire him to the end. A trace of madness appeared on his elegant face, and he laughed drunkenly. Today Zhuang Mohan does not even care about your master's reputation. I really don't know what has made you disregard your former reputation. Others thought that he had lost his mind after being exposed, and that his speech was becoming more and more unbearable. They all frowned. The Empress quietly ordered someone to call in the guards to prevent Fan Xian from doing anything rash. Unexpectedly, His Majesty waved his hand coldly, telling everyone to listen to what Fan Xian had to say. Fan Xian staggered out, his eyes full of ridicule. Bring the wine, he yelled. The palace maids in the back saw his deranged expression and did not dare to come forward. An official, who had been feeling unjust on Fan Xian's behalf, brought over a jar of wine that weighed about 1 kilogram, and brought it to Fan Xian. Thank you. Fan Xian laughed and broke the clay seal on the wine jar. He lifted the jar and drank like a whale drinking from the ocean. In a moment, the wine had been poured into his stomach. After a drunken belch, he felt tipsy. He had drunk a lot that day, and now that he was in a rush to drink, his face was ruddy, his eyes sparkling, and his body swayed uncontrollably. He staggered to the head of the table like he was dancing, and pointed at Zhuang Mohan's nose. Master, do you really insist on saying this? Zhuang Mohan smelled the scent of wine and frowned slightly. It is good that you have a repentant heart. There is no need to hurt yourself like this. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and smiled slightly. His words seemed to be a little unclear. Everything has a cause and effect. Master Zhuang accused me of plagiarizing my teacher's 4 lines. Why did I copy it? Could it be that I cannot win this fame in life and in death just because of that short song from before? The words fame in life and in death were very good, and even Zhuang Mohan was moved. His mind was preoccupied with an urgent matter, and he had no choice but to deliberately frame the young man in front of him. He could not bear to do so, and he slowly moved his head away. Perhaps Master Fan also copied this poem. Copied from whom? Could it be that I wrote this poem was copied? Could it be that Master Zhuang's students are all over the world, and his poems are known all over the world, and you have the right to accuse me of plagiarism? Seeing Zhuang Mohan's finger lightly tapping on the scroll on the table, Fan Xian laughed coldly. Master Zhuang, this kind of trick may work on children, but you say that I copied your teacher's poem. I find it strange that before I wrote it, this poem has never appeared in this world. Zhuang Mohan did not seem to want to argue with him. It was Fan Xian who said in a soft voice, Master Zhuang, my hair is not white, so I cannot speak of the frost in my temples. My body is healthy, so I cannot speak of 100 years of illness. But you do not know that I have always liked to cause trouble, and I intend to start all over again in this life. You do not know my past, so you wrongly accuse me and harm me. How boring. He did not know whether it was because he had drunk too much, or because he had a rare opportunity to vent his pent-up depression, but Fan Xian's elegant face suddenly had a hint of madness. Poetry is the heart. Zhuang Mohan looked at him warmly. My young friend Fan did not have such a past, so how could you write this poem? Poetry is the way of literature. Fan Xian looked at him coldly. The way of poetry is always about talent. Perhaps my poem is a forced expression of sorrow, but who says that things that have not been experienced cannot be turned into one's own poetry? His words were extremely arrogant. He compared himself to a genius, using this to prove that all of Zhuang Mohan's deductions about poetry did not exist. Hearing this, Zhuang Mohan's eyebrows furrowed slightly. He laughed bitterly. Is Master Fan really capable of writing something that has nothing to do with his own experience? This master did not believe it. Even a genius in poetry would not have such ability. Seeing that the other had fallen into his trap, Fan Xian smiled slightly. He took the wine jug from the other's table and drank a mouthful. He looked at him quietly, the drunkenness in his eyes growing stronger. Suddenly he waved his sleeve and shouted 3 times. Paper. Ink. Servants. The drunken man shouted 3 times. Everyone in the hall did not understand what he meant. Only the emperor calmly ordered the serving girls to follow Fan Xian's orders. In a short while they had prepared everything. There was a large empty space in front of the hall. There was only a table, an inkstone, and a man standing alone and proudly in the center. Fan Xian could not stand still. He forced himself to bow to the emperor. I would like to borrow your majesty's writing eunuch. Although the emperor did not understand, he still lowered his head slightly and allowed it. A writing eunuch walked to the table and sat down. He spread out the white paper and ground the ink. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian resisted the drunkenness and shook his head. One is not enough. Fan Xian, what nonsense are you making? The crown prince, who was sitting close to him, could not help but speak. But the emperor still calmly granted his request. His eyes gradually revealed a smile, as if he had guessed what was about to happen. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Zhuang Mohan. The drunkenness in his eyes grew stronger. He spoke to the 3 eunuchs beside him. I'll read you write. If you write too slowly and don't copy it, I won't write it a second time. The 3 eunuchs became nervous for no reason. Many people were guessing what Fan Xian was preparing to do. How could he make the world, between him and Zhuang Mohan, believe that he was the true poet of his generation? It was not long into the night, and the wind at the end of summer was not very cool. But the atmosphere was like the sound of drums on a battlefield. Wildfire cannot burn, the spring wind blows, it grows again. Chaotic flowers gradually dazzle the eyes, only the shallow grass can cover the hooves of horses. The sky and the earth are eternal, but this hatred will never end. Without warning, without any preparation, Fan Xian blurted out a paragraph, all of which were written by Bai Juyi. In a short while there were more than a dozen poems. He stood by the table and gazed out at the night sky outside the palace. He recited all the famous poems that his strange brain could remember. The eunuchs wrote quickly, but they could not keep up with his speed. Everyone was silent, thinking carefully. In the face of endless conspiracies and schemes, under great pressure he finally exploded. In his madness he only cared about reciting the poem in his mind. He did not care if the eunuchs remembered it or not, nor did he care if the people around him understood it. The fragrant words from his previous life passed through his thin lips, echoing endlessly in the palace of the kingdom of Qin. Zhuang Mohan's eyes gradually changed in a strange way, and the officials who had been purely watching the show could not help but mutter to themselves. They had never heard of any of these poems, but they were truly wonderful sentences. Could it be that they were all written by Master Fan? The sky wishes for snow in the evening to drink a cup. This was Bai Ledian drinking. Do you not see? Next it was Tai Bai Lishan's turn to drink. The shadows formed 3 people. This was Tai Bai Ledian still drinking. But the master can get the guest drunk. This was Tai Bai Ledian still drinking. Those who abandoned me yesterday cannot be kept. Those who disturb my heart today is full of worries. This was Tai Bai Ledian drinking. The people in the palace no longer cared about their lack of etiquette. Gradually they sat around Fan Xian, listening to him recite poem after poem. Their faces were full of shock and disbelief. Everyone had ears to listen to a poem. There were many geniuses in the world, but since ancient times, there had never been a scene like this. They had seen poems, but they had never seen one like this. Composing a poem was definitely not like carrying cabbages in a market. But countless lines of poetry poured out of Fan Xian's mouth, as if he didn't need to think about it. It was no different from carrying cabbages. Although some of the lines in these poems were strange, that was because the officials did not know of the illusions of that world. But the officials were still shocked and frightened. These poems, each one was excellent. Fan Xian still did not stop. The officials began to look at Fan Xian strangely. They felt that this elegant young man in front of them was no longer of the mortal world, but a descendant of the heavens. In their fear, the scholars of the imperial library, who had long since sobered up, replaced the 3 eunuchs whose wrists were weak. They began to bury their heads and diligently copy the lines of poetry. Sir Fan Jr. had said earlier that he would only say it once. Fan Xian did not know what was happening around him. His eyes remained closed, his mind working quickly. On one hand he was recalling these lines of poetry and on the other he was thinking about what to do next. If the officials knew that he had the spare time to think about other things, they would probably be even more shocked. He felt a little thirsty, so he stretched his hand into the air beside him. A perceptive imperial scholar had already brought wine over and carefully placed it in his hand, afraid to disturb his current mood. From the Book of Songs about a Gentleman's Desire for Sex, to Gong Zizhen's Silence of 10,000 Horses, the bright moonlight of the Tang Dynasty, the spring river of the Song Dynasty, Du Fu building a thatched hut, Su Dongpa cooking Huangzhou fish, Du Mu visiting a prostitute, Lu Sanbian also visiting a prostitute, Yuan Zhen once having a mistress, Li an embroidered zither thinking about his youth, and Ouyang Xiu loving his niece to death. Fan Xian closed his eyes, took a sip of wine and composed a poem. 3 jugs of wine, 300 poems. In the spacious palace, there seemed to be countless lights and shadows dancing, gradually condensing into a picture that he could only see clearly with his eyes closed. It was the family of poets from his previous life, the old handsome man and the young handsome man from his previous life, singing under the bamboo, bearing their bellies on the bed, walking on the great path in the pavilion, and weeping by the river. This was everything from his previous life. Everything from Fan Xian's previous life had suddenly descended upon the world of the kingdom of Qin, striking at everyone's hearts. Fan Xian, with the help of countless heroes from his previous life, was battling Zhuang Mohan. He suddenly opened his eyes and looked coldly at Zhuang Mohan, but it was as if he was looking at some distant world. Do you not see the waters of the Yellow River come from the heavens? Who could be more free and easy than Li Bai? The waves wash away the heroes of the ages. Who could be more heroic than Su Shi? Last night's rain was light and the wind was strong, and a deep sleep did not dispel the lingering wine. Who could be more graceful than Li Qingzhao? How could the heroes of the ages be defeated by one man? With a crisp clang, Zhuang Mohan's trembling hands could no longer hold onto the wine cup. The cup fell to the stone floor, shattering into countless pieces. Silence. Silence. After some time, Fan Xian finally stopped his crazy performance, but the people in the great hall of the kingdom of Qing's palace were still unable to shake off their emotions. The scholars and eunuchs, who had already been replaced a few times, were the first to wake up. They fell to the ground, rubbing their sore right hands, looking at Fan Xian as if he were a god. Fan Xian had drunk too much. He staggered over to Zhuang Mohan, stretched out a finger to point at his nose and shook it. After a drunken hiccup, he said softly, "In interpreting scriptures, I am not as good as you. In writing poetry, you are not as good as me." The hall was still silent, so although these words were spoken very softly, they fell clearly into everyone's ears. The officials of course believed these words. They had long since prostrated themselves in admiration of Sir Fan Jr.'s poetic talent. No matter how high Zhuang Mohan's reputation was when it came to poetry, anyone who had heard Fan Xian recite 300 ancient poems would never believe that anyone could surpass Fan Xian in poetry. At this time, there was no need to bring up the matter of plagiarism. Everyone had long believed Fan Xian's words. There were so-called geniuses in this world, people who did not need to experience certain things, and yet could still write astonishing poems. What was that just now? That was the skill of immortals in poetry. Copy my ass, attack my ass. Since no one believed that Fan Xian, with his talent, would still copy poetry, then naturally Zhuang Mohan was lying. At this time, everyone in the hall looked at Zhuang Mohan with disappointment, pity, and disdain. They thought that this great master of his generation, who had lived half his life with a clean reputation, had unexpectedly fallen short of virtue in his old age, fighting for fame with a younger generation. Zhuang Mohan looked at Fan Xian as if he were looking at a monster. His eyes revealed a gloomy expression and for some reason, his chest suddenly tightened. He covered his mouth with his white sleeve and spat out a mouthful of blood. The emperor's expression was one of a smile that was not a smile. He looked at Fan Xian and said, "With such talent, why don't you show it normally?" Fan Xian seemed drunk but not drunk. He looked back at the emperor and said, "Poetry is something to cultivate one's character, not a skill to fight bravely." These words were a little shameless. Wasn't he fighting bravely and ruthlessly tonight? Fan Xian finally could not hold back his complaints and the smell of alcohol. He fell on his butt on the steps in front of the emperor. He squinted at Zhuang Mohan, whose lips were trembling slightly. He mumbled, "I am drunk and want to sleep. Go to hell." Finally, he finished his last pose of Li Tai Bai's, and Fan Xian fell into a drunken dream at the emperor's feet. Chapter 136. That night, it was destined to be an unusual one. Fan Xian had gone mad with poetry, and the great Zhuang Mohan had quietly left. His Majesty had made it clear that he wanted to cultivate the eldest son of the Fan family, and the crown prince's position was secure. There was too much information that night, so whether it was the diplomatic mission from Dongyi or the various ministers, when they returned to their manors, they discussed what they had seen with their aides or colleagues. But what shocked everyone the most and what they discussed the most was, of course, the 8th-level functionary Fan Xian's performance in front of the palace. In the end, they all came to a common conclusion: Sir Fan was truly a poet. Some people wondered if Fan Xian had composed so many poems over the years, and then released them all in one night. After all, the circumstances of these poems were different, and the feelings were different. If it was said that he had wandered between such different and intense emotions in one night, and could still form naturally, then the poet would probably go crazy. But no matter which one it was, everyone still believed that Fan Xian was not an ordinary person. Nonsense, what ordinary person could bring out so many good poems like they were cabbages? Even if you were not afraid of getting tired, you still had to be able to grow them. In short, in the world close to the kingdom of Qin, all the beautiful, passionate, or gloomy literary works had been unwillingly or willingly brought down by Fan Xian's mouth. From then on, they had become an inseparable part of the spirit of this world. There were some parts of the poems that people did not understand, and they all took it as Sir Fan's inarticulate speech after drinking too much. They were waiting for him to sober up and ask for advice. As for whether Fan Xian would have to cover up his lies, and thus be forced to write a comprehensive history of China and write the 4 great masterpieces, or whether he would have to castrate himself to avoid trouble, that was a matter for another time. On the carriage back to Fan Manor, Fan Xian was still sleeping soundly. Later, some busybody did some calculations for him. That night at the palace banquet, not to mention how many poems he had composed, he had drunk no less than 9 liters of royal wine. So when his poems were destined to intoxicate many scholars, he himself was already drunk to the point of unconsciousness. He was carried out of the palace by the eunuchs under the feet of His Majesty. His body reeked of alcohol and he was full of complaints. Fortunately, he did not faint in front of the people who looked at him as if he were an immortal. On the carriage of Fan Manor, the eunuchs in the palace carefully instructed the servants of Fan Manor to take good care of their master. The masters had all spoken. This master's head was the treasure of the kingdom of Qin, and they did not dare to damage it. The carriage arrived at Fan Manor. The well-informed members of Fan Manor had long since known that their young master had won a great deal of glory in front of the palace. He had slapped Zhuang Mohan in the face and everyone in the manor shared his glory. The personal attendant happily carried him off the carriage. Madame Lu personally cleared the way and sent him to his bedroom. Then she personally went to the kitchen to cook some soup to sober him up. Fan Ruoruo was worried that the maid was not careful enough, so she carefully wrung the towel and wet his dry lips. Fan Xizha, who had been woken up by the noise, rubbed his sore eyes. He looked at his unconscious, drunk brother with jealousy and admiration. Count Sinan, Fan Jian, was in his study with a smile on his face. Even the uneducated servants could read his master's expression. He wondered what he should write in his memorial to His Majesty. His Majesty should not be surprised by what had happened to Fan Xian. After all, he was the child of a Tianmai. The night gradually grew dark. After a period of excitement, everyone gradually dispersed, not daring to disturb Fan Xian from his drunken dreams. At that moment, he suddenly opened his eyes and said to his sister, who was standing by his bed, "In my belt, there is a light green pill." Ruoruo saw that he had woken up, and without any time to ask questions, she hurriedly took out the pill from her belt and carefully fed it to him. Fan Xian closed his eyes for a long time, slowly circulating his jinqi. He found that the hangover pill was indeed miraculous. There was no longer any discomfort in his chest, nor was there a trace of drunkenness in his brain. Of course, he was not really drunk. Otherwise, when he was reciting in the palace hall, he would have accidentally read out the original author of the poem. That would have been wonderful. I'm worried that someone will come to see me in the middle of the night. After all, I should be drunk and not sober. Fan Xian frowned as he put on his night clothes with his sister's help. His eyes were clear. He had not been as drunk as he had been in the palace. It shouldn't be. I told them that I would take care of you tonight. Fan Ruoruo knew what he was going to do and couldn't help but worry. Lady Lu. Fan Xian frowned. Will she come to take care of me? I'll watch here. No one should come in. Fan Ruoruo looked at his eyes worriedly. But you'd better hurry. Fan Xian touched the dagger in his boot, the 3 needles in his hair and the pill at his waist. He confirmed that he was fully equipped and nodded. I'll hurry. He walked from the back of the manor to the mansion where the wedding was being prepared. By now he was already dressed in night clothes. Under the cover of the night, it would be difficult to see him. Only when he moved, the black light that came with his rapid movements gave him a ghostly feeling. He crawled out from under the wall of the courtyard where a carriage was already parked. Fan Xian frowned slightly. Although there was no curfew in the capital, the streets were still strictly guarded at night. After the incident on Yolan Street, the city patrol had been badly shaken, so they were now especially vigilant. So he temporarily gave up on the idea of using a carriage. With a shake of his body, he circulated his jinqi throughout his body and immediately sped up, disappearing into the darkness of the capital. Fan Manor was not far from the royal palace. Before long, Fan Xian had reached the foot of the western side of the royal palace. That was where the servants of the palace intersected with the inner city. Usually it was lively, but now that night had fallen, it had become quiet. Using the short trees as cover, he lowered his body and leapt to the side of the Yudai River. His left hand hooked onto the stone railing by the riverside, and his whole body moved forward like a koala. The lights in front of him were bright, but the river seemed very dark. Fan Xian did not dare to be careless. Relying on the endless jinqi in his body, he held his breath and carefully moved his body. After an indeterminate amount of time, he finally bypassed 2 arched bridges and came to a quiet forest on the side of the palace. Fan Xian relaxed a little and opened his mouth to take a few quick breaths. He felt his body gradually become excited, as if he was enjoying this dangerous activity. The palace wall next to the forest was at least 15 meters tall, and its surface was extremely smooth. There was no place for him to put his weight on. Even the strongest martial artists in the world could not leap over it. Of course, for the few who had already reached the level of a grandmaster, whether or not this high wall would have any effect remained to be tested in practice. Fan Xian was not one of the 4 grandmasters, but he had other methods. The scarlet wall in front of him looked somewhat blue in the dark. Like a shadow, he skimmed from the forest to the wall. He found a dark corner where the palace lanterns could not illuminate. Forcing himself to calm down, he sat cross-legged and slowly turned the tyrannical jinqi in his body through the snowy mountain into warm threads of qi, adjusting the condition of his body. In the depths of the palace, not far from Hongguang Palace, Hong Xixiang sat quietly in his room. The Empress Dowager was not feeling well that day. She had heard the emperor talk about the funny things that had happened at the court banquet. When she heard that Zhuang Mohan had been angered to the point of vomiting blood by Fan Xian, the Empress Dowager could not help but laugh. But for some reason she seemed to share the sorrow of old people, and so she had gone to bed early. Hong Xixiang had been in the palace for decades, and the young eunuchs did not know how old he really was. They guessed that he was at least 70 or 80 years old. In any case, Hong Xixiang's only duty in the palace was to keep the Empress Dowager company. He had been here since the founding of the Kingdom of Qing. When he was young he liked to wander outside the palace. As he grew older he realized that there was not much difference between the inside and the outside of the palace. Hong Xixiang picked up a peanut, put it into his mouth and chewed it. Then he picked up a small glass of wine and took a sip with enjoyment. The oil lamp on the table was dim. The old eunuch thought of Fan Xian's drunken madness in the palace today, and he could not help but smile. Even if he was a eunuch he was still a eunuch of the Kingdom of Qing. Eunuch Hong was in a good mood to be able to make the people of northern Qi suffer. On the other side of the palace the emperor's study was lit with candles. Naturally it was much brighter than the eunuch's rooms. The current emperor was a diligent ruler who loved his people, so he often read memorials at night. The eunuchs had long gotten used to it. They just kept a midnight snack with warm water waiting to be summoned. It was late at night after the banquet in front of the palace, but the emperor was still diligent. He sat in front of the table holding a brush in his hand. The tip of the brush was stained bright red, like a knife that killed silently. Suddenly, the tip of the brush stopped above the memorial, and his brows gradually furrowed. The eunuch holding the brush said carefully, "Is your majesty tired? Why don't you take a break?" The emperor laughed. "Tonight in the palace, did you not break your hand copying poetry?" The eunuch pursed his lips and smiled. The kingdom produces talented poets. I would love nothing more than to copy poetry like this every day. The emperor smiled and did not say anything more. He only occasionally lifted his head to look out the window, feeling that there was something strange in the dark. The palace was large and it was quiet in the summer. The serving girls half closed their eyes, feeling sleepy, but they did not dare to sleep. The guards were carefully guarding the outer city, but the inner palace was peaceful. In the corner, next to the fake mountain, Wuxia, wearing a brand new set of light brown clothes, melded into the night. The only thing that could be seen was his eyes, which were covered by the black cloth. His entire body seemed to have become an existence very similar to the inanimate objects around him with the help of some kind of method. His breathing and heartbeat had slowed to an extreme, moving in harmony with the gentle night wind around him. Even if someone walked past him, if they did not deliberately look in that direction, it would probably be difficult to notice his existence. Wuxia looked at the light in the emperor's study for who knew how long. Then he slowly lowered his head, put on the black hood, and silently walked in the other direction of the palace. The route he took was very ingenious. He avoided the light and used the terrain to move. He followed the grass and flowers, entered the mountains without a trace, patrolled the lakes without a sound, and was as terrifying as a ghost. It was as if he was taking a leisurely stroll through the heavily guarded palace. Chapter 137. The oil lamp in the room suddenly flickered. This was supposed to be a good sign, but Hong Xixiang's silver eyebrows fluttered, as if he were dissatisfied. His old right hand steadily picked up a fried peanut with chopsticks. Without too much movement, he slowly swallowed the peanut paste in his mouth, tasted the fruit between his teeth, and picked up a cup of wine to drink. Only then did he stand up. It's been many years since anyone has come to this palace. Eunuch Hong's eyes were a little cloudy. He looked out the window with a somewhat listless expression, and then he gently flicked his fingers. The door to the courtyard was open. Like two strong bows, the pair of chopsticks in Eunuch Hong's hands were stimulated by a powerful and profound jinqi. Almost at the same time, the chopsticks smashed the window in front of them and shot straight into the dark corner of the door, towards Wu Zhu's face. The chopsticks carried the wind with them and the momentum was astonishing. If one was hit, it would be like being shot by two strong bows. Eunuch Hong's casual flick of his fingers had such godly power. It was truly terrifying. For some reason, Wu Zhu's reaction seemed to be a little slower than usual. Unable to turn around in time, the chopsticks tore through the clothes on his right shoulder. Swish! The chopsticks stuck into the mud at an angle, the ends of the chopsticks moving slightly. Outside the courtyard, Eunuch Hong looked at the brown-robed guest in front of him. His eyebrows twitched slightly. His face was completely covered by a hood, and it was impossible to see his face clearly. "Who are you?" Eunuch Hong's face was full of smiles. He looked like a lowly servant, but it was clear that he was much more frightening than he appeared. Wu Zhu's brown clothes tonight were brand new, so it felt a little strange. Following Fan Xian's plan, he raised his head as if staring at the other person, then said in a hoarse voice, "Sorry, this is a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding? Are you saying you got lost?" Old Eunuch Hong smiled even more happily. "You are the first person to get lost and come to the Imperial Palace. 5 days ago you should have come here once. I have been waiting for you. I'm very curious about who you are. I think, other than those few old friends of mine, no one else would have the guts to come here." Wu Zhu forced a note of panic into his voice, but he was not good at hiding his emotions, so it sounded fake. "I am bound by my country and have no choice but to enter. It is not convenient for me to greet you with my true face. I hope you will forgive me." Old Eunuch Hong furrowed his brows, no longer beaming with joy. The other party claimed to be a junior, which meant that he was nothing more than a disciple of one of those old monsters. Judging from the other party's skills, he was at least at the 9th level, which was why he was able to sneak into the palace without being discovered. However, the other party's voice was obviously altered by deliberately twisting the muscles in his throat, so he couldn't get any useful information from his accent. "This is the Imperial Palace, child." Eunuch Hong sighed. "Do you think you can come and go as you please?" Having said this, he opened his right hand. His entire body began to slide on the ground. Suddenly he was in front of Wu Zhu. His withered hand pressed toward Wu Zhu's face. Wu Zhu's face was expressionless under the black cloth, but he knew that his opponent had misjudged his abilities. This was a great opportunity to kill him, to kill or not to kill. In the past this would not have been a problem for Wu Zhu, but tonight it was a problem. His brain calculated very quickly. He immediately calculated that even if he killed him now, he would probably have to pay a price. Most importantly, it could alert the other guards in the palace, which would create a lot of trouble for Fan Xian's subsequent actions. So he took a step back, bent his knees and raised his elbow. Under his elbow was a very ordinary fine steel sword. The sword's radiance shot up from his elbow and pierced straight at Eunuch Hong's wrist. The calculation was perfect. More importantly, the dazzling sword intent contained in the sword actually caused the person the tip of the sword was pointing at to momentarily lose his sense of propriety. But Eunuch Hong was no ordinary person. He laughed sinisterly and with a shrill voice he shouted, "Looking to the left?" There was a hint of surprise in his voice, but his movements were not slow. His left hand shot out from his sleeve like a dragon, slamming toward Wu Zhu's chest. This palm came with the wind and the power of the palm was powerful. It was the world's most powerful technique. Wu Zhu took another step back, straightened his knees and raised his elbow. The green sword between his elbow was placed horizontally in front of him, as if he were cutting his throat, but it was just enough to protect his chest, and it was ingeniously enough to block Eunuch Hong's withered palm. Looking to the front? Eunuch Hong's voice grew sharper. He pulled back his palm and from his waist up, his whole body began to tremble. It looked very strange. After a muffled grunt, the old eunuch turned his decades of Jinchi cultivation into countless streams of air, which shot forward, trying to bind Wu Zhu. But Wu Zhu did not give him the opportunity. He coldly took 2 more steps back. These 2 steps seemed simple, but in the face of such a top expert, it was like taking a leisurely stroll in a courtyard. He just happened to avoid the threat of a strong attack. But his body swayed, and it was clear that he had been disturbed by Eunuch Hong's decades of Jinchi. Eunuch Hong's wrinkles deepened. He looked at him coldly and said, "Don't think that you can fool the world just because you changed the direction of your sword. In this forbidden palace, since I have taken a liking to you, you can stay." Wu Zhu slightly raised his head and looked at him. He did not know what to feel, but his next step was to cup his hands. Eunuch Hong frowned in surprise. There was a rustling sound. Wu Zhu turned his body as if Eunuch Hong did not exist behind him. He carried his sword behind his back and ran in the direction of the palace wall. His whole body moved at an incredible speed. He ran on the grass, turning into a cloud of dust. Carrying his sword behind his back was a very simple posture, but it was a perfect defense. Looking to the back? A gloomy light suddenly appeared in Eunuch Hong's eyes. He did not call for the palace guards. His arms shook, and his whole body looked like a thin black bird with an extremely wide wingspan. He chased after Wu Zhu. In just a moment, the 2 of them, one in front of the tall palace wall, came one behind the other. Eunuch Hong looked coldly at the man in brown in front of him. He wanted to see how he could jump over the wall. Wu Zhu rushed directly to the bottom of the palace wall. He did not slow down in the slightest. His right foot stomped hard on the stone at the bottom of the wall. The stone immediately sank into the mud. One could imagine how terrifying the power of this stomp was. And his whole body's forward speed was changed by this shock into an upward force. His whole body was thrown into the air, along the dark palace wall in the night, like a ghost. With this leap he had already covered a distance of 30 feet. Just as he was about to fall, there was a swish. The ordinary sword in his hand, for some reason, had pierced deep into the wall. His body borrowed the power of the sword, flipped over, and like a stone he was thrown out of the high wall. Eunuch Hong gave a muffled grunt. Only now did he realize that his opponent had calculated everything. Jinchi rushed out of his body, and just as he was about to hit the palace wall, he also floated up. But his posture was graceful, and he relied on a breath of Jinchi. Compared to Wu Zhu's ruthlessness, he looked much more at ease. Leaping up to 30 feet, the skinny old eunuch gently extended a finger and pressed it against the hole left by Wu Zhu's sword. Using the force, he flew out of the palace wall. Like a large bird in the night, he slowly floated down the smooth outer wall of the palace wall. As he floated down, his eyes were like an eagle's, fixed on the brown silhouette moving at an incredible speed in the darkness of the capital. With a sinister smile, he quietly floated past the treetops, past the residences and followed. The battle between the 2 top experts didn't make any sound, so the guards in the palace didn't notice anything. Sitting cross-legged like a mouse in the darkness under the palace wall, Fan Xian slightly tilted his head to listen to the faint sound of the wind. He stood up, gently wiped the grass and dust from his buttocks, and pressed his hands against the smooth palace wall. He did not have Wu Zhu's strong body, nor did he have Eunuch Hong's profound Nigong cultivation. But the way he used Jinshi was different from that of all the strong martial artists in the world. He could even climb the moss-covered cliff outside Danzhou, let alone this palace wall. This was Fan Xian's greatest advantage. His entire body was like a flightless bat, slowly climbing up the palace wall. Although slow, it was very steady and there was no way he would fall. If it was suddenly daytime and someone was watching from afar, they would certainly see an ugly black dot on the vermilion palace wall. Climbing over the palace wall, he carefully avoided possible hidden sentries. Finally, Fan Xian's feet safely stepped onto the palace grass. While meditating outside the palace wall, he had already gone over the palace map he had designed in his mind a few times. Now, standing in the palace, looking at the huge palace complex under the night sky, and listening to the faint sound of the clock in the distance, Fan Xian's heart was a little nervous, but also a little excited. At this moment, the map seemed to have become a clear path for his eyes. After a final breath adjustment, he disappeared into the darkness of the imperial palace. Not only did he not make a single sound, he did not slow down in the slightest. Relying entirely on his memory, he used the cover of the rockery and flowers to advance towards his destination. His method was very similar to Wu Zhu's, but there were some subtle differences. After all, his ability to calculate was still not as good as Wu Zhu's. It was already late at night and most of the people in the palace were asleep. Fan Xian hid in the darkness outside Hongguang Palace, and confirmed that there were no aces in the inner palace. The real armed guards seemed to be in the front hall and the corner tower. This knowledge made him frown. The palace guards were so weak it was a very risky thing to do. If Northern Qi sent a large number of aces to invade, what would he do? As a thief who broke into the Forbidden Palace at night, and still worried about the country and its people, Fan Xian was truly a wonderful person. But his calculations were actually a little unnecessary. In this world, the only people who could jump over a 15-meter wall without alerting the guards were those who stood at the very top of the world. If such a grandmaster came, the ordinary guards would not be of much use. He had forgotten that he was the only one who knew Spider-Man's kung fu. Chapter 138. Wu Zhu had entered the palace for the last time 5 days ago. He had confirmed that the key was hidden somewhere in Hongguang Palace, so Fan Xian had searched there first. Perhaps it had been peaceful for too long, but Hongguang Palace, where the Empress Dowager lived, was quiet and peaceful. The serving girls on night watch had all fallen asleep, and the eunuchs responsible for watching the incense burner were also drowsy. A faint fragrance wafted by. Both the eunuchs and the serving girls fell into a deep sleep. In the dim light, Fan Xian followed a relatively dark corner and slid into the bedroom. His eyes looked at the strangely luxurious bed in the distance and furrowed his brows slightly. The old woman covered by a thin silk blanket was the Empress Dowager? He didn't have time to sigh too much, nor would he express his senseless fantasies about how history could be changed in his hands. He only calmly walked forward and walked to the side of the bed. He didn't even glance at the woman on the bed, who was probably the most powerful woman in the world. Calmness was the most important quality that Wu Zhu and Fei Jie had taught Fan Xian. There was no ace hidden in the palace that Fan Xian had anticipated. In his previous plans, he had always thought that the palace would be like what Gulong had written. Beside the Emperor and Empress Dowager, there would always be hidden killers who would never see the light of day. He didn't look around Hongguang Palace to see where the treasure could be hidden. Instead, he slid directly under the Empress Dowager's bed and closed his eyes. His palms began to caress the wooden boards under the bed. The wood was excellent, but his actions were a bit strange. Not long after, he opened his eyes in the darkness under the bed. His pupils were clear and a trace of absurd joy flashed through them. In Danzhou, he had hidden the nameless martial secret in a secret compartment under the bed. In the Deer and the Cauldron, Mao Dongzhu had also hidden the 42-chapter sutra in a secret compartment under the bed. The Empress Dowager of the Kingdom of Qing also had a secret compartment under her bed. Sometimes, the human imagination was very poor. The dagger pressed lightly and slid in from the side. The blade cut through the wood noiselessly, but the Empress Dowager turned over on the bed. The old woman mumbled something. Fan Xian's face was expressionless. It was as if he hadn't heard anything. He continued to work steadily. In a short while he had taken down the secret compartment. He didn't dare to reach out and flip through it, but his night vision was very strong, so he easily and luckily saw what it was. There were no jewels or banknotes in the secret compartment, only a piece of white cloth, a letter and a key. Fan Xian looked at the shape of the key and furrowed his brows slightly. A strange expression appeared on his face. He didn't take out the white cloth or the letter. He just put the key in his pocket and slid it out. A moment later he reappeared beneath the palace walls. Climbing into the carriage, Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian and quietly said, "What I need is speed." Yes. Wang Qinian did not know what his mission was today. He only knew that he had to pick up his master at this street corner and then meet the person he had invited back. "I don't want anyone to know that I'm in this carriage." "Don't worry, sir. This is a car borrowed from the Bureau of Military Affairs. No one will dare to stop it and no one will know." "Very good." Fan Xian's mind relaxed a little. He leaned back in his seat and frowned. First, he had faked his drunkenness, and then he had to sneak into the palace at night. It had taken a lot out of him. The carriage arrived at a courtyard that Fan Xian was completely unfamiliar with. The two of them quietly got out of the carriage, put on their masks again, and went straight to a secret underground room. Wang Qinian said in a muffled voice, "Sir, this is a locksmith." In front of the two of them, on a small wooden table were many metal tools that neither of them could recognize. They glowed faintly under the light. The owner of the tools was a middle-aged man who looked somewhat honest and slow. His face was a sheet of iron, but he had a simple and honest smile on his face. Locksmith was a profession and it was also a form of address. But this middle-aged man was not called a locksmith because of his appearance. His name was a locksmith, and from this one could see the extent of his skill. Fan Xian nodded and said to Wang Qinian, "Wait outside." Wang Qinian bowed his head and left the secret room. He knew that there were some things that he would never know, and that was the safest. This matter concerns the interests of the country. As a member of the Bureau of Military Affairs, I ask that you do something for the country, Fan Xian said calmly through his mask. The locksmith's heart trembled. He thought of the foreign envoys that had recently come to the capital, and he suddenly thought he had guessed something. He quickly bowed, unsure of what he had to do. "Be fast and accurate." Fan Xian took the key from his belt. "It has to be exactly the same." The locksmith took it and looked at it carefully. He frowned. "There is no lock like this in the world." "I don't care. I just want you to make a copy of this key. Can you do it or not?" "It's very difficult. This key is too complicated. Even if the shape is exactly the same and no one can detect it, I can't guarantee that the copied key will be able to open the corresponding lock." "Very well, let's begin." Fan Xian was pleasantly surprised by the reply, but his voice was still cold. The locksmith nervously copied the key, and from time to time came the sound of grinding iron. Fan Xian also nervously looked at the door of the secret room. He didn't know how long Wu Zhu could stall Eunuch Hong. Eunuch Hong lived too close to Hongguang Palace. If Eunuch Hong returned to the palace, it would be difficult for Fan Xian to put the copied key back. Finally, the locksmith finished his work, sweating profusely. He handed the key to Fan Xian. Fan Xian compared the two keys and found that the copied key was exactly the same. Even the rust on it was almost identical. He finally relaxed a little. He smiled and asked, "What did you do before?" His face was covered with a black cloth, so his smile looked a bit strange. I was a thief." The locksmith was sweating profusely. He didn't know what he had to face after completing such a secretive task. Fan Xian thought to himself, so it's someone in the same line of work. He squinted at the tools and molds left on the table and frowned. He walked to the table and grunted. Tyrannical Jinchi rushed out of his body and smashed all the molds in his hands. He told Wang Qinian to destroy the metal tools as well and send the locksmith south for a while. Only then did Fan Xian relax and return to the palace. He re-entered Hongguang Palace. The sweet fragrance had faded, but the night breeze was still gentle. The atmosphere of peace and harmony filled the palace. Like a ghost, Fan Xian slid under the bed and put back the copied key. He took out the adhesive he had brought with him and rearranged the secret compartment. Only then did he quietly leave the palace. Fan Xian didn't know how long it had been since the last bell rang. He knew it was time for him to leave. But at that moment, his eyes fell on a small courtyard on the other side of the palace. It was Guangxin Palace, where the eldest princess lived. Fan Xian's plan for today had been perfect. If he didn't want to complicate things, he should have immediately left the palace and waited for things to gradually develop. Perhaps it was the joy of obtaining the key that got to his head, or for some other reason Fan Xian's next move was somewhat unexpected. He believed that under the cover of darkness, even in a palace as strict as the palace, he would still be able to walk freely. Walking along the corridors, Wu Zhu and Fei Jie, the two masters of darkness, relied entirely on their nocturnal abilities. With great difficulty, they approached Guangxin Palace. Along the way they even brushed past a yawning palace maid. Guangxing Palace was still lit. It was obvious that there were people inside. Guangxing Palace was different from the other palaces in the palace. There was a small wall outside the palace. As the saying goes, if you've already crossed the river, what's there to be afraid of? But Fan Xian knew that many masters eventually died at the hands of mediocre people. So he carefully circled to the back of the palace, closed his eyes and climbed up the thick pillar. His palm fell on the smooth surface of the pillar. Fan Xian had used up too much of his jinqi that day. He couldn't help but feel flustered and impatient, so it was a bit difficult to climb up. Carefully he climbed to the roof of Guangxing Palace. He didn't dare to open the roof tiles to peek. Instead, he squinted his eyes and looked for the hard-to-find bright tiles among the glazed tiles. Perhaps his luck was too good. The roof of the royal palace did not need bright tiles, but the eldest princess was someone who liked daylight. So Fan Xian found one and carefully crouched down, lowering his head to ensure that each simple movement was stable and did not make any noise. Under the bright tile the light was not bright. But with Fan Xian's eyesight he could still see and hear clearly. He squinted, knowing that he had guessed correctly. And his luck was good. The eldest princess, Li Yunrui, reclined on the couch. Her face was languid and she looked charming. She only wore a white robe. Under the thin silk, the curves of her body were revealed. There was a hint of youth in her maturity. If any man in the world were to see her, they would probably bow down to her bare feet. As the emperor's closest sister, she didn't need to use her beauty to seduce him. And the man in front of her was 70 years old. Before tonight, he was known as the world's foremost scholar of morality. He wasn't someone who could be seduced. Zhuang Mohan coughed twice. My business is done. I hope the eldest princess will not break the agreement. The eldest princess played with the fake scroll that she had spent a fortune to make. She smiled sweetly, filling the room with spring. In a soft and timid voice she said, I want Master Zhuang to trample Fan Xian to the ground, so that he will no longer have the face to stay in the capital. Can you do that? Chapter 139. Zhuang Mohan smiled. By framing him today, I have staked 70 years of my reputation on the line. If I lose, I am willing to accept the consequences. What I do not understand is that Master Fan is like a celestial being in poetry. If you had told me earlier, I would not have humiliated myself. The eldest princess sighed. I did not expect that child to have such a demented temperament in addition to his reputation for poetry. Zhuang Mohan closed his eyes, a look of regret on his face. After a while he said slowly, I am not regretting anything else. I am only lamenting that I have been sober for half my life. Now that I am old, I have done such an ugly thing. If Master Fan hadn't written 300 poems in one night, perhaps the people of the world would have believed that Master Fan was a shameless plagiarist because of what I said. The old man opened his eyes. They were calm and clear again. He smiled. That is fine. Fine. The eldest princess's bare feet slid gently along the edge of the couch. She bit her lip and said bitterly, Master Zhuang, Mother has always respected your talent and virtue. That is why I invited you to live in the palace. I have fulfilled my promise to you. What about your promise to me? Do you think that the agreement between the two countries has been signed, and that your brother will soon be welcomed back home, that Fan Xian will be able to preserve his reputation, and that you, old fox, will feel at ease? Zhuang Mohan smiled. A mistake is a mistake. My heart belongs to my family. That is why I fell into the eldest princess's trap and came to Qin. My brother has killed countless people in the first half of his life. If the eldest princess wishes to go back on her word, there is nothing I can do. I can only pray for him after I return to northern Qi. I hope that he will live a more comfortable life in the prison of the Overwatch Council. The eldest princess smiled. I sold Yan Bingyun to your student, the emperor. That was the only way you could bring Shaoan back to northern Qi. This deal was not between you and me but between your emperor and me. But I have already fulfilled my end of the bargain, and you have not done what you promised me. Tonight in the palace, if you had not pretended to spit out blood and admitted defeat, but instead insisted that Fan Xian's poem was a copy, who knows what would have happened. So, Master Zhuang, after you return, remember to send a message to your emperor's students. Northern Qi owes Guangxing Palace a favor. Zhuang Mohan smiled. Master Fan is talented, and his poetic ability is beyond the reach of ordinary people. I believe the eldest princess has also guessed that this Master Fan is a Tianmai who has not appeared in the world for a long time. I'm very curious. The kingdom of Qing has a Tianmai. Why is it that they are not in a hurry to protect him? Instead, they want to get rid of him. What's more, even if he were to accuse Master Fan of plagiarism, what harm would it cause him? The eldest princess said lightly, I have never believed in the nonsense of a Tianmai being. Master Zhuang is well-read and should know what the saints say. If Fan Xian was some Tianmai person, if his ability was only in reciting poetry and such small things, what good would it do the Qing court? As for why I want to deal with him, that has nothing to do with you. Zhuang Mohan had staked decades of his life on the peerless position he held in the hearts of the world's scholars. He wanted to trample Fan Xian underfoot, and it was all because of the eldest princess. But he did not know the complicated relationships in the Qing court, nor did he know that the eldest princess and Fan Xian would become mother-in-law and son-in-law in the near future. But Fan Xian knew why the eldest princess wanted to deal with him. He half knelt on the roof of the palace, his 3 fingers on the tiles were a little cold. Looking at the charming princess in her early 30s below the bright tiles, the coldness in his eyes gradually increased. When Guo Baoquan spoke in the hall, Fan Xian knew that the nobles of the palace had joined forces with Zhuang Mohan to drive him out of the capital. The matter of plagiarism seemed like a small matter, but it involved the so-called character. If he had not been talking about poetry in the hall and shocked the entire hall, perhaps everyone would have believed Zhuang Mohan's words. He had become a literary thief. Although he would not be punished and his career could be discussed later, his marriage with Wanner might fall through. The eldest princess knew better than he did what the Empress Dowager did not like. What chilled Fan Xian even more was that the former head spy of Northern Wei, Xiao En, in the secret agreement between the two countries, was Zhuang Mohan's elder brother. In order to persuade Zhuang Mohan to come to the Qing kingdom to suppress him, the eldest princess did not hesitate to sell the head spy of the Qing kingdom stationed in northern Qi, the son of a court official Yan Bingyun, to the enemy country. She was too daring. How could the emperor in the palace tolerate his own sister doing such a thing that harmed the country's integrity? The summer night breeze blew through the eaves of Guangxin Palace, calming the frowning Fan Xian. He knew that even if he heard these secrets, he could not use them to threaten her. She was the emperor's sister and the Empress Dowager's favorite daughter. These 2 identities alone were enough for her to run amok in the Qing kingdom, selling out officials for her own personal gain. Fan Xian looked at the woman's jet-black hair on the couch below and felt a wave of disgust. This woman was not only crazy but also perverted. At this moment, Fan Xian seemed to see the whole plot clearly. The agreement between the eldest princess and the emperor of northern Qi was to sell out the head spy of the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, who had been undercover in northern Qi for 4 years, in exchange for Xiao En and Si Lily. The price northern Qi offered was to invite the world-famous Zhuang Mohan to the capital of the Qing kingdom and use his mouth to destroy Fan Xian. At the same time, they could use this to teach a lesson to the Overwatch Council, which had never listened to the eldest princess. However, he didn't know what else was included in the agreement between her and the emperor of northern Qi. Fan Xian guessed that by selling off the head spy of the Qing kingdom in northern Qi, the eldest princess must have obtained more than this. She must have obtained something even more terrifying. Did the emperor know what his own sister was doing? He touched the hard key at his waist and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He thought of a way to deal with this, adjusted his breathing in the night wind and began to retreat. The palace was too dangerous and he did not know how long his good luck would last. Just as he stepped off the pillar, he saw 2 people slowly approaching from the end of the corridor, holding palace lanterns. Fan Xian's heart trembled, and he carefully hid his body in the shadow of the pillar. As the lanterns neared, he moved his feet subtly, keeping his body in the same area as the shadows. He secretly prayed that this serving girl would be like the one who had passed by him earlier, and would not discover him. The serving girl had already walked past the pillar, and Fan Xian had already moved to the other side of the pillar. Suddenly the palace maid stopped. This palace maid seemed to have some status in Guangxin Palace. She whispered something to the little girl who was following her. The little girl responded sweetly and left. The middle-aged palace maid stood and waited. The distance between her and Fan Xian was only 1 wooden pillar. Fan Xian carefully adjusted his breathing with Jinqi, gradually matching the breathing of the serving girl behind the pillar. At the same time, he heard with some peace of mind that there was no change in the serving girl's breathing. It seemed that she had stopped here by coincidence and had not discovered him. The 2 of them were still separated by a wooden pillar. Suddenly, a cold light flashed in Fan Xian's eyes, which were not covered by his black mask. His entire body twisted a few inches to the left. This innate sense of danger had allowed him to escape a disaster. Where his body had originally been, the sharp tip of a sword had silently pierced through the wooden pillar. Because the wooden pillar was too big, the tip of the sword only extended a little. It was cute and full of killing intent, and it told Fan Xian that if he had not twisted earlier, the tip of the sword would have been in his waist. Fan Xian coldly circled around the long pillar, and like a mudfish, he accurately locked his hand forward and grabbed the middle-aged serving girl's left forearm. His reaction was different from that of a normal fighter, and he did not care about the other party's movement to draw the sword. The effect was very good. The serving girl's sneak attack had failed, and she was afraid that the assassin would stop her from drawing the sword, so she concentrated all her jinchi on her right arm, and the defense of her left arm was much weaker. With the sound of a piece of paper being torn apart, the serving girl drew the sword from the wooden pillar, and opened her mouth to scream. Fan Xian's eyebrows relaxed, and the tyrannical jinchi in his body poured into the other party's left arm with great vigor. This palace maid had the strength of level 7, but she had never encountered the strange genuine qi in an assassin's body. She felt a stabbing pain in her meridians, as if countless knives were scraping the tender walls of her meridians. This kind of pain made the palace maid's chest tighten, and she actually swallowed the warning sound, making a strange soft sound in her throat. Fan Xian recognized at a glance that this serving girl was the one who had welcomed him into Guangxing Palace. Her eyebrows were extremely long, and her appearance was very special. The serving girl's eyebrows trembled, and she circulated the jinchi in her body, wanting to fight him head-on. She did not know that the hand holding her arm would suddenly lose its jinchi, and all the jinchi she had circulated around her body would fall into thin air. In a daze, she felt very uncomfortable. Because of this sudden imbalance, the right side of her body seemed to be slightly sluggish. In this split second, the right side of her neck went slightly numb, and then she immediately felt her entire body become slightly stiff. Fan Xian frowned and his 2 fingers retracted from her neck. He knew that the poison on the needle could not truly seal the throat with blood. He immediately flipped his right palm over, and pressed it against the serving girl's abdomen, where the ribs connected. With a muffled sound, the serving girl's chest caved in, and blood flowed from all her orifices. She died. Chapter 140. He didn't know if the young serving girl had gone to report, or if it was a trap set up by the serving girl who had died by his hand. But Fan Xian knew that although he hadn't let the serving girl make a sound during the fight, the true masters of the palace must have been alerted. So he didn't care about the corpse on the ground. The tip of his foot touched the stone floor, and his whole body turned into a sharp arrow, flying in the direction of the palace wall he had planned. The palace wall was still as high as ever. Fan Xian was a little annoyed at his own speed. When he finally reached the top of the wall, he heard a buzzing sound behind him, as if the air behind him had begun to tremble. He turned his head in shock and saw a general on the corner tower of the palace far away, looking at him with a bow drawn. In the night sky, an arrow flew toward his face like a soul-devouring divine object. A breath ago the arrow was on the horizon. A breath later the arrow was in front of him. The arrow seemed to have a ruthless spirit on it, insufferably arrogant. Fan Xian let out a wild roar. The black cloth on his face was shaken to pieces by this roar. The nameless tyrannical jinchi that he had quietly cultivated in his body for 16 years, in this moment of life and death, wildly and ruthlessly poured into his hands. His fists met in the air and just so happened to hit the shaft of the arrow. In a moment, the violent jinchi in his fists collided with the powerful force of the arrow. The shaft of the arrow had already been smashed into powder, and the arrowhead narrowly brushed past Fan Xian's hair, piercing the night sky far away. A loud noise rang through the night sky of the palace, startling those who were sleeping and waking them up. It was like a sudden clap of thunder on the palace wall. This arrow was too powerful. It didn't seem like something a mortal could shoot. After blocking it with his fists, the jinchi in Fan Xian's body was depleted. He fell down the palace wall dispiritedly and powerlessly. His black clothes fluttered in the night wind. He looked very wretched. Far away on the corner tower of the palace wall, Yan Xiaoyi, the commander of the royal palace, watched the assassin fall down the palace wall. Her eyes narrowed, revealing a very valiant expression. She said coldly, "He's not dead. Go catch him." Yes. The subordinate guard received the order and left. Under the palace wall, Fan Xian, dressed in black, fell. Just as he was about to hit the ground, he forcefully twisted his body, one knee, one foot, and one hand on the ground. He crashed into the ground with a muffled thud. The powerful force made him spit out blood, wetting the remaining pieces of black cloth on his face. Immediately after, he gave a low roar and ran toward the forest outside the palace walls. In the instant before the guards at the corner of the city appeared, he disappeared into the darkness of Jingdo. The next day, in an inconspicuous small room at the foot of the imperial city, old eunuch Hong didn't seem to be in good spirits. He sat on the main seat with his eyes half closed. The two generals were also resting with their eyes closed. It seemed that no one was willing to speak. After a long time, Deputy Commander Gong Dian, who had been resting at home the night before, said softly, "His Majesty is shocked." The commander of the imperial palace, Yin Xiaoyi, who had shot Fan Xian off the wall with an arrow last night, now slowly opened his eyes. He said coldly, "One of the eldest princess's personal serving girls died. The eldest princess is very angry." After the two of them spoke, Eunuch Hong slowly opened his eyes. In a slightly aged voice he said, "Yesterday I fell for the trap of luring the tiger away from the mountain. The Empress Dowager is very unhappy." "Who was it?" Gong Dian asked matter-of-factly. In his heart, even if it was luring the tiger away with Eunuch Hong, a peerless ace who still had the power of a tiger even in his illness, there was no chance of escape. "I don't know." Eunuch Hong smiled slightly. The level he displayed was only above the 9th level, but he was very familiar with the buildings of Jingdo, especially in the dark. "I was led around Jingdo a whole time, but in the end I still lost him. This person is very impressive." For Eunuch Hong to say that someone was impressive, that person must truly be impressive. Yin Xiaoyi was 35 years old and was at the peak of his mental state. As the commander of the guards in the palace, he was responsible for the safety of the entire royal palace. He looked coldly at Eunuch Hong and said, "Where did you follow him to in the end?" "In an alley not far from the Dongyi diplomatic mission," Gong Dian said. "The results of today's investigation are out." Eunuch Hong's chopsticks pierced through the clothes of the first assassin. After the Overwatch Council compared them, they confirmed that they came from Qianxiang satin. Yin Xiaoyi closed his eyes to rest. Gong Dian continued, "The Overwatch Council found out that some time ago, the Dongyi diplomatic mission had ordered a batch of clothes from Qianxiang. They did not use the name of the diplomatic mission, but had someone else help them." Eunuch Hong quietly asked, "What are you trying to say, Deputy Commander?" Gong Dian smiled. "Why would they use someone else's name to order clothes? Clearly they were worried that we would catch some small trace. Looking at all the clues, the first assassin should have been someone from Dongyi. The only one who could be above the 9th level is Sigusword's first disciple, Yun Jilan, who has been quiet in the capital these days." Yin Xiaoyi suddenly opened his eyes. It wasn't Yun Jilan. If someone from Dongyi wanted to sneak into the palace, why would he need to buy new clothes? He could just knock out a random person on the street and strip them. Yun Jilan is a straightforward person. Eunuch Hong nodded. Although that 9th level person hid his sword will, he still walked the path of Sigusword. So I am very interested. If it wasn't Yun Jilan, could it be that someone from Dongyi came and dared to disobey Yun Jilan's orders? The possibility of framing someone is very high. Gong Dian listened to the two of them and frowned. It's too much of a coincidence. So it could be that someone framed Yun Jilan. How many people in Dongyi could inherit Sigusword's legacy? Including Yun Jilan, there are 3 9th level people. Then the other 2 are suspects. Let's talk about the night traveler who was shot down by the commander. I heard that the power of the commander's arrow shook the entire palace. Unfortunately, it didn't kill him. From the tone of his voice, it seemed that Eunuch Hong and this commander did not get along very well. Yin Xiaoyi looked down on this eunuch, but he knew that he was the most powerful person in the imperial palace. He snorted coldly and said, "The second assassin was also a 9th level figure. Although he was only below the 9th level, if I could kill him with 1 arrow, wouldn't I become one of the 4 grandmasters?" Another 9th level? Gong Dian was full of shock. He himself had been hovering above the 8th level all his life, unable to advance even an inch. When he heard that 2 9th level aces had sneaked into the palace last night, he could not help but feel many complicated emotions. There are only 7 9th level masters in the entire kingdom of Qin, and only 4 in the capital. How could there be so many 9th level masters in the world? Eunuch Hong said lightly. Clearly he didn't believe Commander Yan's judgment. He thought that Yin Xiaoyi was trying to shirk his responsibility. Gong Dian was always afraid of this kind of situation. He quickly said, "His Majesty has ordered us to close this case within 10 days. I will immediately send people from the Overwatch Council to investigate the situation in each palace. First, we must determine why they would take such a big risk to sneak into the palace. Yin Xiaoyi shook his head. I don't know why the second person did it, but the first person must have something to do with Dongyi. So we must start with the Dongyi diplomatic mission and find out why the clothes were ordered. It would be best if we could find out where each piece of clothing went. As they were preparing to investigate, a young eunuch suddenly rushed in and announced the emperor's decree. Last night's incident was to be investigated by Yi Zhong, the commander of the capital garrison. The palace guards were to act as usual, and no one was to announce it. After the eunuch left, the 3 palace guards in the room looked at each other. Yin Xiaoyi slowly closed his eyes. He knew that His Majesty was beginning to suspect one of them. Eunuch Hong walked out with his hands behind his back, his face calm. A few days later, the capital searched for the assassin but found nothing. His Majesty's decree actually helped Fan Xian, the true person who entered the palace. In this plan there were not many mistakes in any aspect, but forcing Wu Zhu to wear the new brown clothes was a bit presumptuous and gave the game away. Fan Xian secretly found out that Dongyi had ordered the clothes from Qianxiang satin because the son of the master of Dongyi liked the traditional style of clothes in the capital, so he ordered a batch. As for why the order had been made under a secret name, it was actually for a very simple reason. The young master of Dongyi, a place where all the merchants and merchants met, actually admired the clothing of the southern barbarians of Qin. If this news got out, he would probably be cursed to death by the merchants of Dongyi, who had always been very bold. Of course, Fan Xian had used this trick mainly because he didn't believe that Wu Zhu could perfectly imitate Sigu Jian's sword will. If he had known earlier that Wu Zhu was so powerful, Fan Xian would certainly have used the framing trick more perfectly. But the ending was not bad. At least the palace still suspected the other 2 9th-level aces of Dongyi. The Overwatch Council also began to investigate the day the enemy came from the palace and where the other 2 disciples of Sigu Jian were. No one would think it was Fan Xian. Because on the night the enemy came from the palace, all the high-ranking officials of the capital saw him drink thousands of cups of wine and write hundreds of poems in the Great Hall. Zhuang Mohan, the master of Northern Qi, was so angry that he vomited blood and wished that his hair could turn white overnight. In the end, he was completely drunk and collapsed at the feet of His Majesty. This was the error of human thinking. Not only did they think that a drunken Fan Xian could not get out of bed, but people were used to the fact that after a person did something shocking, they could not immediately do something else. After an orgasm, it was impossible to have another orgasm. There had to be a refractory period. Chapter 141. Fan Xian lay safely and comfortably on the bed. His face was pale and he looked like a young man with a hangover. There was a copper basin next to the bed. It was very clean because the vomit had long since been cleaned up. Ruoruo had already been driven to bed by him, and another servant girl was attending to him. Fan Xian's pale face was not faked, and his vomiting was not caused by medicine. The force on Yin Xiaoyi's arrow had truly injured his internal organs. His chest felt a wave of irritation. He would probably need to rest for a few days before he could recover. Thinking of that soul-devouring arrow, Fan Xian could not help but feel afraid. If he had not exploded with Jinqi at the moment of life and death, he feared that he really would have been killed by that arrow. It was hard to imagine that the arrow still had such power from so far away. It seemed that the commander was already at the upper 9th level, and could step into the pinnacle of the human world at any time. Actually, when he had used both hands to smash the arrow, Fan Xian's hands had not been as fast as the arrow, so he had only smashed into the shaft. It was very dangerous, but fortunately there were no wounds on his hands. Otherwise, if someone had seen it, he would not know how to explain it. At the time, he had taken the risk to go to Guangxin Palace to see if he could find anything. He also didn't want the people in the palace to think of the key in Hongguang Palace because Eunuch Hong had been lured away by Wu Zhu. That was the most important thing. His fingers gently rested on his waist, slowly stroking that hard thing. His heart was filled with happiness. His luck was really good, but would his luck really be good forever? He decided that he would never hide things in the secret compartment under his bed again, and he would never go to the palace to play again. In the few days that he had been pretending to be drunk, Fan Xian's immortal performance in the palace had long since spread throughout the capital. Countless scholars and nobles had come to visit, but Fan Jian had coldly blocked them outside, saying that his son had exhausted himself that day and needed to rest. But the level of the people who came was getting higher and higher. Even the descendants of some of the founding fathers and high-ranking military officers had come. Just as Fan Jian was having a headache, Fan Xian used the mouths of people in the manner to announce a decision that everyone was puzzled and regretful. Fan Xian would no longer write poetry. Many people thought that Master Fan was just spouting nonsense and did not take it seriously. Only Prince Jing's Ren and Xian, who understood Fan Xian's temperament a little, knew that this matter was probably true. But in any case it was still in the aftermath, so they could slowly discuss it later. The summer heat in the capital had gradually disappeared, and an autumn rain slowly floated down. In reality there were only 3 days until he entered the palace, but Fan Xian felt that these 3 days were the longest of his 2 lives. The box was under his bed and the key was in his hand. There was no greater temptation than this, but Fan Xian still endured it for 3 days. He was like a child who stole a snack from the kitchen that his mother did not allow him to eat, and then carefully hid it in the wardrobe. Then, knowing that the snack was there, he went to sleep, satisfied. Every day before he went to sleep, he glanced at the wardrobe, but he did not really want to eat it, until the snack finally went bad. The box would not go bad, but Fan Xian still decided to eat it tonight. Outside the window, the autumn rain fell in a pitter-patter, landing in the backyard of Fan Manor and on the flowers and plants that were about to go through autumn frost. Fan Xian did not light a lamp inside the window. He knew that his eyes could see clearly in the dark. The box was placed on the table and he steadily inserted the key into the brass keyhole. With a click, the plywood in front of the box sprang open, revealing a small black board. There were some strange little squares on the board. With a light press, the squares would sink down. Each square had a unique pattern and no one in this world could recognize these patterns. Fan Xian smiled, but this smile was a little bitter, a little understanding, and a little consolation that had finally been confirmed after a long time of guessing. He closed his eyes and couldn't help but laugh again. He felt that this world was really too crazy. So, with trembling fingers, he lit a pot of the good local tobacco that Ting Zijing had given him to calm his mood. This was the first time he had smoked in the world of the kingdom of Qing. The smell of smoke was very good. White smoke rose in spirals in the dark room, and the autumn rain slowly fell in the lonely courtyard. Fan Xian felt that he would never be lonely again. The people of this world would not know what these little black squares were, nor would they know what the strange patterns on the squares were. But Fan Xian knew. Because after the lock on the box was opened, what was revealed was a keyboard. It was a very familiar keyboard from his previous life. The strange patterns on it were actually 26 English letters, as well as the numeric keys and the F5 that Fan Xian was most familiar with. After seeing this, the matter that Fan Xian had secretly guessed for a long time had finally been confirmed. The mother of his physical body, the woman called Yi Qingmei, had come from the same place as him. At this moment, he did not think of the Tianmai being mentioned in the conversation between Zhuang Mohan and the eldest princess in Guangxin Palace. The dimly lit tobacco pot flickered in the dark room. Fan Xian's face had already recovered its calm. His hands gently placed on the keyboard and he began to guess what the password was. It's the name. Wu Zhu, who had come to his side at some point, stood in the corner of the room. Although his eyes were covered by a black cloth, his face, facing the box, revealed an emotion that people would call sorrow. I only remember the name. The lady said there were only 5 strokes. Fan Xian nodded calmly and began to type. After all, it had been 16 years since he had come into contact with this kind of thing. At first it felt strange, but after many tries that familiar feeling returned to his body and his hands. His fingers danced across the keyboard. But after many tries he suddenly smiled bitterly and raised his head. There is no name in this world that requires only 5 strokes. As soon as he said this, he knew what the problem was. He took 2 more puffs of his tobacco, looked at the box in front of him and shook his head. He sighed. Mother, you really are messing around. But the problem is, did you teach Wu Zhu the 5 strokes before? The 5 strokes were not 5 strokes but a 5-stroke input method. Kfulkand. Fan Xian entered the first name Yi Qingmei. There was no response. He entered the 5 strokes of his own name with some uncertainty. Ibusi. There was still no response from the box. He smiled bitterly, thinking that his name had been chosen many years later. How could Yi Qingmei have known? Suddenly he had a thought. He looked at Wu Zhu, who was in the corner of the room, with a faint smile. Wu Zhu seemed to feel his strange gaze. He tilted his head slightly. What are you doing? Fan Xian did not answer him. Instead he entered Wu Zhu's name. Gigttj. The box made a soft sound and then opened. Fan Xian looked at Wu Zhu again and smiled. Uncle, I now suspect that there is some indecent secret between you and Mother. Fan Xian had brought the box from Danzhou to the capital. Of course, he knew the weight of the box, so he was not worried that there was a hydrogen bomb hidden inside. But when he saw the contents of the box, he could not help but shake his head as he walked out of the room and foolishly into the rainy night. He thought to himself that his mother really did not have much creativity. The box was divided into 3 layers. Due to its limited shape, the items that could be placed in each layer had to be long and narrow. The first layer had metal tools that were divided into 3 parts. Some were tubular and some seemed to be suitable for holding. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he looked at the metal tubes. Although he was also from Earth, he did not immediately understand what they were. It was not until he stuck his finger into one of the metal tubes that he began to understand. He raised a part of it to his eyes and looked at it carefully. He found that there was a line of letters, M82A1. Ah, Mother, Father. Fan Xian's finger trembled slightly. Although he was not a military enthusiast in his previous life, he knew what this line of letters represented. This was a sniper rifle. This was the best sniper rifle in that world. If it was equipped with armor-piercing bullets, it could pierce through a thick wall from a kilometer away. Fan Xian's right hand grabbed the barrel of the gun. His hand could not help but tremble. He understood that in a society like the Kingdom of Qin, which was still in the age of cold weapons, if he had a sniper rifle in his hand, it would mean something. It meant that from now on, he would have the ability to kill anyone from a few kilometers away without fear of being discovered. It meant that regardless of whether it was the commander who had shocked the heavens with his arrow or Yun Jilan from the Dongyi diplomatic mission, as long as he wanted to, he could kill them countless times over. But he did not know if it would be effective against a grandmaster. Fan Xian nervously placed the 3 parts of the sniper rifle on the table. He had long since put the smoking pot to one side. He placed both hands on the table and took a few deep breaths to calm himself down. It seemed that he already had all the necessary requirements to become a demon of the night. Of course, the prerequisite was that he had bullets. Fan Xian looked at the second layer, dumbfounded. Aside from a letter, there was nothing else. There were no more than 10 bullets as he had expected. Without bullets, this sniper rifle was no better than a fire stick. Chapter 142. Where are the bullets? Fan Xian was like a girl who woke up from a sweet dream to find herself sleeping on the firewood in the kitchen. He lowered his voice and asked Wu Zhu angrily. Wu Zhu's answer was honest, but it sounded clever to others. What are bullets? Fan Xian was annoyed. He could only describe to Wu Zhu the shape of a bullet, its size, length, and how to use it. Full of anticipation, he asked, "Did you see my mother use this thing before?" Wu Zhu shook his head. "I told you I forgot some things." Just as Fan Xian was feeling slightly disappointed, Wu Zhu suddenly opened his mouth and said, "However, I remember that the things you mentioned seemed to have no use back then, so when I carried you away, I threw them all in the cellar of Taiping Courtyard." Fan Xian's temperament had long been trained to be very calm, but hearing this he couldn't help but want to hug this cute blind man and give him a big kiss. There was a letter in the second compartment of the box. The box was well sealed, so when Fan Xian lightly flicked the letter, no dust fell. To Wu Zhu. Fan Xian didn't know what to feel. So this box wasn't for him but for the person next to him. He forced a smile and handed the letter to Wu Zhu, as if forgetting that he was blind. Wu Zhu didn't take it. "The lady let me see it," he said coldly, "for you to hear. Just read it." Fan Xian smiled, tore open the letter and began to read. After reading a few lines he couldn't help but smile. He had thought that the box contained the will of the divine weapon. It was a very uncreative thing and he couldn't help but look down on his mother's methods. But after reading this letter, he realized that the woman called Yi Qingmei really did look down on all the men in the world. The handwriting wasn't elegant, and it was much worse than Ruorwo's. It even seemed a little rough and sloppy, and the tone of the letter was also very strange. Moreover, the words inside didn't connect. It seemed that they hadn't been written at the same time. "Cute little Zhu, give me a kiss? I really like you. I've wanted to introduce you to a wife many times, but you've always been cold. Be gentle. I'm really angry. If you go to that temple to fight, I guess you still won't be able to win and will have to run back like a dog. So I wrote something to make fun of you." Seeing this, Fan Xian couldn't help but glance at Wu Zhu. How could such a handsome grandmaster look like a dog? The letter continued, "What about me? When you left, I drugged someone with an aphrodisiac and succeeded in borrowing his seed. I just don't know if it will be a precious daughter or a bastard son. This box is the only thing I've left in this world. Old Mao said that in this life he had only affected the area around Beijing. Remember, I also said that when I came to this world, I only left behind this box. Seeing the words borrow seed and bastard of a son, Fan Xian almost fell off the stool. It turned out that not only was his life strange but it was also quite romantic. It was a pity that the letter did not clearly state who he had borrowed the seed from. This was the biggest question in Fan Xian's heart. The following were the original words of Fan Xian's mother, Yi Qingmei, who had once shocked the world. It's sad, isn't it? Other than you, there is probably no one else in this world who can open this box. Who told me to be so gentle and kind as to teach you the 5 strokes that are useless in this world? Cute little Juju doll, I really want to hug you to sleep. Come back quickly. I've put the box back in its old place. You should know where it is. Hey, if you open the box and see this letter, then of course you know where it is. I seem to have said some nonsense again. I'm just curious now. Will I have a daughter or a son? If it's a daughter, that's good. If it's a son, it'll be his father's turn to worry. And men are too ambitious. Who knows what they'll do? Okay. I admit that I'm ambitious, but I want to make this world a better place. Should this little girl's beautiful wish be described as ambition? Why do I feel like I'm writing my last words? Damn it. Baba, that's too unlucky. Who knows? Let's just say it's my last words. I've already written it down. Remember, don't use this broken spear. There's no strength in chopping ants with a broadsword. After reading this letter, destroy this box. Don't let those random people in this world know of my glorious life. They don't deserve it. I've been here, seen it, played it. I've been the richest man. I've killed princes. I've plucked the beard of an old emperor. I've used the sunshine of this world to shine. I've almost unified the world. But I just don't care. How about it? My precious daughter and bastard son. I don't think they can do as much as I can. Just live on in peace. Sigh. When I die of old age, will I be able to return to that world? Father, mother, I miss you very much. Little Juju, you don't understand what I'm saying. You don't know where I came from. I'm very lonely. People come and go in this world, but I'm still lonely. I'm very lonely. I'm very lonely. After reading the letter, Fan Xian was silent for a long time. Then he smiled and asked softly, I'm not from this world. Do you remember? Wu Zhu opened his mouth slowly. I think I remember a little. Mother said that you went to fight with the people of the temple. Did that fight make you lose part of your memory? Fan Xian's hand slowly slid along the edge of the box. I think so. If you didn't lose that part of your memory, you should be the one to open this box. After you open it, will you tell me everything? I don't think so. Fan Xian nodded. I thought so too. Maybe you'll find a small mountain village that no one knows about and grow up with me. A smile appeared on his face. Maybe that's not a bad life. He then sighed and shook his head helplessly. It's a pity that you can't start over. Why aren't you curious that I can open this box? Fan Xian teased Wu Zhu. He wanted to see the shocked expression on Wu Zhu's face when he found out that he was also a soul from another world. Why should I be curious? Wu Zhu was still very calm. He suddenly felt that the young master was just like the young lady. They were both very long-winded and boring humans. Fan Xian felt like an idiot. Does her death have anything to do with the temple? He asked. I don't know. Fan Xian was silent for a while, then continued to look at the box. There was a piece of paper stuck to the last layer of the box. He measured the difference in height between the inside and the outside. This layer should be very thin. He peeled off the paper and looked at it. He was stunned. On the paper was written, Hey, if it was Wu Zhu after seeing that letter, you should immediately destroy this box. You actually want to keep looking. Tell me the truth. Who are you? How did you open this box? His mother really was a person with a heart of crystal. Fan Xian was lost for a moment. He replied in a daze, I am your son. Of course she couldn't hear this answer. The paper was very short. There weren't many words on it. At the end there was only a warning. If it's not my daughter, then it's my son. You can look at what's below when you've killed someone. Remember. Looking at the exaggerated exclamation mark and the empty circle below it, Fan Xian didn't dare disobey his mother's last words. He obediently stuck the paper back on the box. I'm going out for a walk. Fan Xian said this to Wu Zhu, then left the room. With his head down, he walked into the early autumn rain. The box was with Wu Zhu, so it couldn't be safer. He wasn't worried. After Fan Xian's somewhat dispirited silhouette disappeared into the rain, Wuxia slowly walked out from the corner and sat down at the table. His fingers stroked the box and the gun on the table, then fell on the letter. His fingers lightly moved back and forth on the envelope. It was unclear what he was thinking. A slight rustling sound rang out between his fingers and the letter. The rustling sound rang out between the rain and the grass in the courtyard. The room was pitch black. Wuxia sat alone next to a box. The black cloth on his face softened, and a very gentle expression appeared on his face. Fan Xian walked alone on the street in the rainy night, letting the rain wash over his face and soak his body. A glimmer of a smile occasionally appeared on his face. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a faint sorrow. A moment later it was calm again. Who knew how many emotions were fermenting in his heart, interweaving and colliding? Yi Qingmei, that dazzling name, seemed to have only truly entered his life and entered his mind today. He now understood many things. He knew where his mother came from and what she had done in this world. His grandmother in Danzhou had said that before his father ascended the throne, the two princes were the most likely to inherit the throne of the Qing kingdom. The two princes, on the other hand, died in a ridiculous murder case. After reading the letter, Fan Xian naturally knew that the two princes, who were always on guard against assassinations, had died under his mother's sniper rifle. In other words, the present royal family of the Qing kingdom was completely dependent on his mother to be able to have this world. His mother had built Qingyu Hall and established the Overwatch Council. She had provided the most basic of everything for the country to become powerful. It could even be said that without Yi Qingmei, there would be no present Qing kingdom. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.